Now reading The Monk, a romance by M.G. Matthew Gregory, Lewis, a public domain text. Chapter 3. These are the villains whom all the travellers do fear so much. Some of them are gentlemen such as the fury of ungoverned youth, thrust from the company of awful men, T.W.O. Gentleman O.F. Verona. The Marquis and Lorenzo proceeded to the hotel in silence. The former employed himself in calling every circumstance to his mind, which related might give Lorenzo's the most favourable idea of his connection with Agnes. The latter, justly alarmed for the honour of his family, felt embarrassed by the presence of the Marquis. The adventure which he had just witnessed forbade his treating him as a friend, and Antonia's interests being entrusted to his mediation, he saw the impolicy of treating him as a foe. He concluded from these reflections that profound silence would be the wisest plan, and waited with impatience for Don Raymond's explanation. They arrived at the Hotel de las Cisternas. The Marquis immediately conducted him to his apartment, and began to express his satisfaction at finding him at Madrid. Lorenzo interrupted him. "Excuse me, my lord," said he with a distant air, "if I reply somewhat coldly to your expressions of regard. A sister's honour is involved in this affair. Till that is established, and the purport of your correspondence with Agnes cleared up, I cannot consider you as my friend. I am anxious to hear the meaning of your conduct, and hope that you will not delay the promised explanation. First give me your word that you will listen with patience and indulgence. I love my sister too well to judge her harshly, and till this moment I possessed no friend so dear to me as yourself. I will also confess that your having it in your power to oblige me in a business which I have much at heart makes me very anxious to find you still deserving my esteem. Lorenzo, you transport me. No greater pleasure can be given me than an opportunity of serving the brother of Agnes. Convince me that I can accept your favours without dishonour, and there is no man in the world to whom I am more willing to be obliged. Probably you have already heard your sister mention the name of Alfonso d'Alvarado? Never. Though I feel for Agnes an affection truly fraternal, circumstances have prevented us from being much together. While yet a child she was consigned to the care of her aunt, who had married a German nobleman. At his castle she remained till 2 years since, when she returned to Spain, determined upon secluding herself from the world." Good God! Lorenzo, you knew of her intention, and yet strove not to make her change it? Marquis, you wrong me. The intelligence which I received at Naples shocked me extremely, and I hastened my return to Madrid for the express purpose of preventing the sacrifice. The moment that I arrived, I flew to the convent of St. Clair, in which Agnes had chosen to perform her novitiate. I requested to see my sister. Conceive my surprise when she sent me a refusal. She declared positively that, apprehending my influence over her mind, she would not trust herself in my society till the day before that on which she was to receive the veil. I supplicated the nuns. I insisted upon seeing Agnes, and hesitated not to avow my suspicions that her being kept from me was against her own inclinations. To free herself from the imputation of violence, the prioress brought me a few lines written in my sister's well-known hand, repeating the message already delivered. All future attempts to obtain a moment's conversation with her were as fruitless as the first. She was inflexible, and I was not permitted to see her till the day preceding that on which she entered the cloister, never to quit it more. This interview took place in the presence of our principal relations. It was for the first time since her childhood that I saw her, and the scene was most affecting. She threw herself upon my bosom, kissed me, and wept bitterly. By every possible argument, by tears, by prayers, by kneeling, I strove to make her abandon her intention. I represented to her all the hardships of a religious life. I painted to her imagination all the pleasures which she was going to quit, and besought her to disclose to me what occasioned her disgust to the world. At this last question she turned pale, and her tears flowed yet faster. She entreated me not to press her on that subject, that it sufficed me to know that her resolution was taken, and that a convent was the only place where she could now hope for tranquillity. She persevered in her design, and made her profession. I visited her frequently at the grate, and every moment that I passed with her made me feel more affliction at her loss. I was shortly after obliged to quit Madrid. I returned but yesterday evening, and since then have not had time to call at St. Clair's convent. Then till I mentioned it, you never heard the name of Alfonso d'Alvarado? Pardon me, my aunt wrote me word that an adventurer so called had found means to get introduced into the castle of Lindenberg, that he had insinuated himself into my sister's good graces, and that she had even consented to elope with him. However, before the plan could be executed, the Cavalier discovered that the estates which he believed Agnes to possess in Hispaniola in reality belonged to me. This intelligence made him change his intention. He disappeared on the day that the elopement was to have taken place, and Agnes, in despair at his perfidy and meanness, had resolved upon seclusion in a convent. She added that as this adventurer had given himself out to be a friend of mine, she wished to know whether I had any knowledge of him. I replied in the negative. I had then very little idea that Alfonso d'Alvarado and the Marquis de las Cisternas were one and the same person. The description given me of the first by no means tallied with what I knew of the latter. In this I easily recognized Donna Rodolfo's perfidious character. Every word of this account is stamped with marks of her malice, of her falsehood, of her talents for misrepresenting those whom she wishes to injure. Forgive me, Medina, for speaking so freely of your relation. The mischief which she has done me authorizes my resentment, and when you have heard my story, you will be convinced that my expressions have not been too severe. He then began his narrative in the following manner. History of Don Raymond, Marquis de las Cisternas. Long experience, my dear Lorenzo, has convinced me how generous is your nature. I waited not for your declaration of ignorance respecting your sister's adventures to suppose that they had been purposely concealed from you. Had they reached your knowledge, from what misfortunes should both Agnes and myself have escaped? Fate had ordained it otherwise. You were on your travels when I first became acquainted with your sister, and as our enemies took care to conceal from her your direction, it was impossible for her to implore by letter your protection and advice. On leaving Salamanca, at which university, as I have since heard, you remained a year after I quitted it, I immediately set out upon my travels. My father supplied me liberally with money, but he insisted upon my concealing my rank and presenting myself as no more than a private gentleman. This command was issued by the counsels of his friend, the Duke of Villahermosa, a nobleman for whose abilities and knowledge of the world I have ever entertained the most profound veneration. Believe me, said he, my dear Raymond, you will hereafter feel the benefits of this temporary degradation. 'Tis true that as the Conde de las Cisternas you would have been received with open arms, and your youthful vanity might have felt gratified by the attention showered upon you from all sides. At present, much will depend upon yourself. You have excellent recommendations, but it must be your own business to make them of use to you. You must lay yourself out to please. You must labor to gain the approbation of those to whom you are presented. They who would have courted the friendship of the Conde de las Cisternas will have no interest in finding out the merits or bearing patiently with the faults of Alfonso d'Alvarado. Consequently, when you find yourself really liked, you may safely ascribe it to your good qualities, not your rank, and the distinction shown you will be infinitely more flattering. Besides, your exalted birth would not permit your mixing with the lower classes of society, which will now be in your power, and from which, in my opinion, you will derive considerable benefit. Do not confine yourself to the illustrious of those countries through which you pass. Examine the manners and customs of the multitude, enter into the cottages, and by observing how the vassals of foreigners are treated, learn to diminish the burthens and augment the comforts of your own. According to my ideas of those advantages which a youth destined to the possession of power and wealth may reap from travel, he should not consider as the least essential the opportunity of mixing with the classes below him and becoming an eye-witness of the sufferings of the people. Forgive me, Lorenzo, if I seem tedious in my narration. The close connection which now exists between us makes me anxious that you should know every particular respecting me, and in my fear of omitting the least circumstance which may induce you to think favourably of your sister and myself, I may possibly relate many which you may think uninteresting. I followed the Duke's advice. I was soon convinced of its wisdom. I quitted Spain, calling myself by the assumed title of Don Alfonso d'Alvarado, and attended by a single domestic of approved fidelity. Paris was my first station. For some time I was enchanted with it, as indeed must be every man who is young, rich, and fond of pleasure. Yet among all its gaieties I felt that something was wanting to my heart. I grew sick of dissipation. I discovered that the people among whom I lived, and whose exterior was so polished and seducing, were at bottom frivolous, unfeeling, and insincere. I turned from the inhabitants of Paris with disgust, and quitted that theatre of luxury without heaving one sigh of regret. I now bent my course towards Germany, Intending to visit most of the principal courts prior to this expedition, I meant to make some little stay at Strasbourg. On quitting my chaise at Luneville to take some refreshment, I observed a splendid equipage, attended by 4 domestics in rich liveries, waiting at the door of the Silver Lion. Soon after, as I looked out of the window, I saw a lady of noble presence, followed by 2 female attendants, step into the carriage, which drove off immediately. I inquired of the host who the lady was that had just departed. A German baroness, monsieur, of great rank and fortune. She has been upon a visit to the Duchess of Longueville, as her servants informed me. She is going to Strasbourg, where she will find her husband, and then both return to their castle in Germany. I resumed my journey, intending to reach Strasbourg that night. My hopes, however, were frustrated by the breaking down of my chaise. The accident happened in the middle of a thick forest, and I was not a little embarrassed as to the means of proceeding. It was the depth of winter, the night was already closing round us, and Strasbourg, which was the nearest town, was still distant from us several leagues. It seemed to me that my only alternative to passing the night in the forest was to take my servant's horse and ride on to Strasbourg, an undertaking at that season very far from agreeable. However, seeing no other resource, I was obliged to make up my mind to it. Accordingly, I communicated my design to the postilion, telling him that I would send people to assist him as soon as I reached Strasbourg. I had not much confidence in his honesty, but Stefano being well armed, and the driver to all appearance considerably advanced in years, I believed I ran no danger of losing my baggage. Luckily, as I then thought, an opportunity presented itself of passing the night more agreeably than I expected. On mentioning my design of proceeding by myself to Strasbourg, the postilion shook his head in disapprobation. "It is a long way," said he. "You will find it a difficult matter to arrive there without a guide. Besides, monsieur seems unaccustomed to the season's severity, and 'tis possible that unable to sustain the excessive cold." "What use is there to present me with all these objections?" said I, impatiently interrupting him. "I have no other resource. I run still greater risk of perishing with cold by passing the night in the forest." "Passing the night in the forest," he replied. "Oh, by St. Denis, we are not in quite so bad a plight as that comes to yet. If I am not mistaken, we are scarcely 5 minutes' walk from the cottage of my old friend, Baptiste. He is a woodcutter, and a very honest fellow. I doubt not but he will shelter you for the night with pleasure. In the meantime, I can take the saddle-horse, ride to Strasbourg, and be back with proper people to mend your carriage by break of day." "And in the name of God," said I, "how could you leave me so long in suspense? Why did you not tell me of this cottage sooner? What excessive stupidity! I thought that perhaps monsieur would not deign to accept." "Absurd! Come, say no more, but conduct us without delay to the woodman's cottage." He obeyed, and we moved onwards. The horses contrived with some difficulty to drag the shattered vehicle after us. My servant was become almost speechless, and I began to feel the effects of the cold myself before we reached the wished-for cottage. It was a small but neat building. As we drew near it, I rejoiced at observing through the window the blaze of a comfortable fire. Our conductor knocked at the door. It was some time before anyone answered. The people within seemed in doubt whether we should be admitted. Come, friend Baptiste," cried the driver with impatience. "What are you about? Are you asleep, or will you refuse a night's lodging to a gentleman whose chaise has just broken down in the forest?" "Ah, is it you, honest Claude?" replied a man's voice from within. "Wait a moment, and the door shall be opened." Soon after the bolts were drawn back. The door was unclosed, and a man presented himself to us with a lamp in his hand. He gave the guide an hearty reception, and then addressed himself to me. "Walk in, monsieur, walk in, and welcome. Excuse me for not admitting you at first, but there are so many rogues about this place that, saving your presence, I suspected you to be one." Thus saying, he ushered me into the room where I had observed the fire. I was immediately placed in an easy chair, which stood close to the hearth. A female, whom I supposed to be the wife of my host, rose from her seat upon my entrance, and received me with a slight and distant reverence. She made no answer to my compliment, but immediately reseating herself, continued the work on which she had been employed. Her husband's manners were as friendly as hers were harsh and repulsive. "I wish I could lodge you more conveniently, monsieur," said he, "but we cannot boast of much spare room in this hovel. However, a chamber for yourself and another for your servant, I think, we can make shift to supply. You must content yourself with sorry fare, but to what we have, believe me, you are heartily welcome." Then, turning to his wife, "Why, How you sit there, Marguerite, with as much tranquillity as if you had nothing better to do. Stir about, dame, stir about. Get some supper, look out some sheets, here, throw some logs upon the fire, for the gentleman seems perished with cold. The wife threw her work hastily upon the table, and proceeded to execute his commands with every mark of unwillingness. Her countenance had displeased me on the first moment of my examining it. Yet upon the whole, her features were handsome unquestionably, but her skin was sallow, and her person thin and meagre. A lowering gloom overspread her countenance, and it bore such visible marks of rancour and ill will as could not escape being noticed by the most inattentive observer. Her every look and action expressed discontent and impatience, and the answers which she gave Baptiste, when he reproached her good-humouredly for her dissatisfied air, were tart, short, and cutting. In fine, I conceived at first sight equal disgust for her, and prepossession in favour of her husband, whose appearance was calculated to inspire esteem and confidence. His countenance was open, sincere, and friendly. His manners had all the peasant's honesty unaccompanied by his rudeness. His cheeks were broad, full, and ruddy, and in the solidity of his person he seemed to offer an ample apology for the leanness of his wife's. From the wrinkles on his brow I judged him to be turned of 60, but he bore his years well, and seemed still hearty and strong. The wife could not be more than 30, but in spirits and vivacity she was infinitely older than the husband. However, in spite of her unwillingness, Marguerite began to prepare the supper, while the woodman conversed gaily on different subjects. The postillion, who had been furnished with a bottle of spirits, was now ready to set out for Strasbourg, and inquired whether I had any further commands. "For Strasbourg?" interrupted Baptiste. "You are not going thither tonight?" "I beg your pardon, if I do not fetch workmen to mend the chaise, how is monsieur to proceed tomorrow?" "That is true, as you say, I had forgotten the chaise." "Well, but Claude, you may at least eat your supper here." "That can make you lose very little time, and Monsieur looks too kind-hearted to send you out with an empty stomach on such a bitter cold night as this is." To this I readily assented, telling the postillion that my reaching Strasbourg the next day an hour or two later would be perfectly immaterial. He thanked me, and then leaving the cottage with Stefano, put up his horses in the woodman's stable. Baptiste followed them to the door, and looked out with anxiety. "'Tis a sharp, biting wind," said he. "I wonder what detains my boys so long. Monsieur, I shall show you two of the finest lads that ever stepped in shoe of leather. The eldest is 23, the second a year younger. Their equals for sense, courage, and activity are not to be found within 50 miles of Strasbourg. Would they were back again. I begin to feel uneasy about them." Marguerite was at this time employed in laying the cloth. "And are you equally anxious for the return of your sons?" said I to her. "Not I," she replied peevishly. "They are no children of mine." "Come, come, Marguerite," said the husband. "Do not be out of humour with the gentleman for asking a simple question. Had you not looked so cross, he would never have thought you old enough to have a son of 23, but you see how many years ill temper adds to you. Excuse my wife's rudeness, monsieur. A little thing puts her out, and she is somewhat displeased at your not thinking her to be under 30. That is the truth, is it not, Marguerite? You know, monsieur, that age is always a ticklish subject with a woman. Come, come, Marguerite, clear up a little. If you have not sons as old, you will some 20 years hence, and I hope that we shall live to see them just such lads as Jacques and Robert." Marguerite clasped her hands together passionately. "God forbid," said she, "God forbid! If I thought it, I would strangle them with my own hands." She quitted the room hastily and went upstairs. I could not help expressing to the woodman how much I pitied him for being chained for life to a partner of such ill humour. "Ah, Lord! Monsieur, everyone has his share of grievances, and Marguerite has fallen to mine. Besides, after all, she is only cross and not malicious. The worst is that her affection for 2 children by a former husband makes her play the stepmother with my 2 sons. She cannot bear the sight of them, and by her good will they would never set a foot within my door. But on this point I always stand firm, and never will consent to abandon the poor lads to the world's mercy, as she has often solicited me to do. In everything else I let her have her own way, and truly she manages a family rarely, that I must say for her." We were conversing in this manner when our discourse was interrupted by a loud halloo which rang through the forest. "My sons, I hope," exclaimed the woodman, and ran to open the door. The halloo was repeated. We now distinguished the trampling of horses, and soon after a carriage, attended by several cavaliers, stopped at the cottage door. One of the horsemen inquired how far they were still from Strasbourg. As he addressed himself to me, I answered in the number of miles which Claude had told me, upon which a volley of curses was vented against the drivers for having lost their way. The persons in the coach were now informed of the distance of Strasbourg, and also that the horses were so fatigued as to be incapable of proceeding further. A lady, who appeared to be the principal, expressed much chagrin at this intelligence. But as there was no remedy, one of the attendants asked the woodman whether he could furnish them with lodging for the night. He seemed much embarrassed, and replied in the negative, adding that a Spanish gentleman and his servant were already in possession of the only spare apartments in his house. On hearing this, the gallantry of my nation would not permit me to retain those accommodations of which a female was in want. I instantly signified to the woodman that I transferred my right to the lady. He made some objections, but I overruled them, and hastening to the carriage, opened the door and assisted the lady to descend. I immediately recognized her for the same person whom I had seen at the inn at Luneville. I took an opportunity of asking one of her attendants what was her name. "Ah, the Baroness Lindenberg," was the answer. I could not but remark how different a reception our host had given these newcomers and myself. His reluctance to admit them was visibly expressed on his countenance, and he prevailed on himself with difficulty to tell the lady that she was welcome. I conducted her into the house and placed her in the armchair which I had just quitted. She thanked me very graciously, and made 1,000 apologies for putting me to an inconvenience. Suddenly, the woodman's countenance cleared up. "At last I have arranged it," said he, interrupting her excuses. "I can lodge you and your suite, madam, and you will not be under the necessity of making this gentleman suffer for his politeness. We have 2 spare chambers, one for the lady, the other, monsieur. For you, my wife shall give up hers to the 2 waiting. Women, as for the men servants, they must content themselves with passing the night in a large barn, which stands at a few yards' distance from the house. There they shall have a blazing fire, and as good a supper as we can make shift to give them." After several expressions of gratitude on the lady's part, and opposition on mine to Marguerite's giving up her bed, this arrangement was agreed to. As the room was small, the Baroness immediately dismissed her male domestics. Baptiste was on the point of conducting them to the barn which he had mentioned when 2 young men appeared at the door of the cottage. "Hell and furies!" exclaimed the first, starting back. "Robert, the house is filled with strangers." "Ha! There are my sons!" cried our host. "Why, Jacques, Robert, whither are you running, boys? There is room enough still for you." Upon this assurance the youths returned. The father presented them to the Baroness and myself, after which he withdrew with our domestics, while at the request of the 2 waiting women, Marguerite conducted them to the room designed for their mistress. The 2 newcomers were tall, stout, well-made young men, hard-featured, and very much sunburnt. They paid their compliments to us in few words, and acknowledged Claude, who now entered the room, as an old acquaintance. They then threw aside their cloaks in which they were wrapped up, took off a leathern belt to which a large cutlass was suspended, and each drawing a brace of pistols from his girdle laid them upon a shelf. "You travel well armed," said I. "True, monsieur," replied Robert. "We left Strasbourg late this evening, and 'tis necessary to take precautions at passing through this forest after dark. It does not bear a good repute, I promise you." "How?" said the Baroness. "Are there robbers hereabout?" "So it is said, madame. For my own part, I have travelled through the wood at all hours, and never met with one of them." Here Marguerite returned. Her stepsons drew her to the other end of the room and whispered her for some minutes. By the looks which they cast towards us at intervals, I conjectured them to be inquiring our business in the cottage. In the meanwhile, the Baroness expressed her apprehensions that her husband would be suffering much anxiety upon her account. She had intended to send on one of her servants to inform the Baron of her delay, but the account which the young men gave of the forest rendered this plan impracticable. Claude relieved her from her embarrassment. He informed her that he was under the necessity of reaching Strasbourg that night, and that would she trust him with a letter. She might depend upon its being safely delivered. "And how comes it," said I, "that you are under no apprehension of meeting these robbers?" "Alas, monsieur, a poor man with a large family must not lose certain profit, because 'tis attended with a little danger, and perhaps my lord the Baron may give me a trifle for my pains. Besides, I have nothing to lose except my life, and that will not be worth the robber's taking." I thought his arguments bad, and advised his waiting till the morning, but as the Baroness did not second me, I was obliged to give up the point. The Baroness Lindenberg, as I found afterwards, had long been accustomed to sacrifice the interests of others to her own, and her wish to send Claude to Strasbourg blinded her to the danger of the undertaking. Accordingly, it was resolved that he should set out without delay. My Baroness wrote her letter to her husband, and I sent a few lines to my banker, apprising him that I should not be at Strasbourg till the next day. Claude took our letters and left the cottage. The lady declared herself much fatigued by her journey. Besides having come from some distance, the drivers had contrived to lose their way in the forest. She now addressed herself to Marguerite, desiring to be shown to her chamber, and permitted to take half an hour's repose. One of the waiting women was immediately summoned. She appeared with a light, and the Baroness followed her upstairs. The cloth was spreading in the chamber where I was, and Marguerite soon gave me to understand that I was in her way. Her hints were too broad to be easily mistaken. I therefore desired one of the young men to conduct me to the chamber where I was to sleep, and where I could remain till supper was ready. "Which chamber is it, mother?" said Robert. "The one with green hangings," she replied. "I have just been at the trouble of getting it ready, and have put fresh sheets upon the bed. If the gentleman chooses to lollop and lounge upon it, he may make it again himself for me." "You are out of humour, mother, but that is no novelty." "Have the goodness to follow me, monsieur." He opened the door and advanced towards a narrow staircase. "You have got no light," said Marguerite. "Is it your own neck or the gentleman's that you have a mind to break?" She crossed by me and put a candle into Robert's hand, having received which, he began to ascend the staircase. Jacques was employed in laying the cloth, and his back was turned towards me. Marguerite seized the moment when we were unobserved. She caught my hand and pressed it strongly. "Look at the sheets," said she as she passed me, and immediately resumed her former occupation. Startled by the abruptness of her action, I remained as if petrified. Robert's voice, desiring me to follow him, recalled me to myself. I ascended the staircase. My conductor ushered me into a chamber, where an excellent wood fire was blazing upon the hearth. He placed the light upon the table, inquired whether I had any further commands, and on my replying in the negative, he left me to myself. You may be certain that the moment when I found myself alone was that on which I complied with Marguerite's injunction. I took the candle, hastily approached the bed, and turned down the coverture. What was my astonishment, my horror, at finding the sheets crimsoned with blood. At that moment, 1,000 confused ideas passed before my imagination. The robbers who infested the wood, Marguerite's exclamation respecting her children, the arms and appearance of the 2 young men, and the various anecdotes which I had heard related, respecting the secret correspondence which frequently exists between banditti and postilions, all these circumstances flashed upon my mind, and inspired me with doubt and apprehension. I ruminated on the most probable means of ascertaining the truth of my conjectures. Suddenly, I was aware of someone below pacing hastily backwards and forwards. Everything now appeared to me an object of suspicion. With precaution, I drew near the window, which, as the room had been long shut up, was left open in spite of the cold. I ventured to look out. The beams of the moon permitted me to distinguish a man whom I had no difficulty to recognize for my host. I watched his movements. He walked swiftly, then stopped and seemed to listen. He stamped upon the ground and beat his stomach with his arms as if to guard himself from the inclemency of the season. At the least noise, if a voice was heard in the lower part of the house, if a bat flitted past him, or the wind rattled amidst the leafless boughs, he started and looked round with anxiety. "Plague take him," said he at length with impatience. "What can he be about?" He spoke in a low voice, but as he was just below my window, I had no difficulty to distinguish his words. I now heard the steps of one approaching. Baptiste went towards the sound. He joined a man, whom his low stature and the horn suspended from his neck declared to be no other than my faithful Claude, whom I had supposed to be already on his way to Strasbourg. Expecting their discourse to throw some light upon my situation, I hastened to put myself in a condition to hear it with safety. For this purpose I extinguished the candle, which stood upon a table near the bed. The flame of the fire was not strong enough to betray me, and I immediately resumed my place at the window. The objects of my curiosity had stationed themselves directly under it. I suppose that during my momentary absence the woodman had been blaming Claude for tardiness, since when I returned to the window, the latter was endeavouring to excuse his fault. "However," added he, "my diligence at present shall make up for my past delay." "On that condition," answered Baptiste, "I shall readily forgive you. But in truth, as you share equally with us in our prizes, your own interest will make you use all possible diligence. 'Twould be a shame to let such a noble booty escape us. You say that this Spaniard is rich? His servant boasted at the inn that the effects in his chaise were worth above 2,000 pistoles. Oh! How I cursed Stefano's imprudent vanity. And I have been told, continued the postilion, that this Baroness carries about her a casket of jewels of immense value. Maybe so, but I had rather she had stayed away. The Spaniard was a secure prey. The boys and myself could easily have mastered him and his servant, and then the 2,000 pistoles would have been shared between us four. Now we must let in the band for a share, and perhaps the whole covey may escape us. Should our friends have betaken themselves to their different posts before you reach the cavern, all will be lost. The ladies' attendants are too numerous for us to overpower them. Unless our associates arrive in time, we must needs let these travellers set out tomorrow without damage or hurt. 'Tis plaguey, unlucky that my comrades who drove the coach should be those unacquainted with our confederacy. But never fear, friend Baptiste. An hour will bring me to the cavern. It is now but 10 o'clock, and by 12 you may expect the arrival of the band. By the by, take care of your wife. You know how strong is her repugnance to our mode of life, and she may find means to give information to the ladies' servants of our design. Oh! I am secure of her silence. She is too much afraid of me, and fond of her children, to dare to betray my secret. Besides, Jacques and Robert keep a strict eye over her, and she is not permitted to set a foot out of the cottage. The servants are safely lodged in the barn. I shall endeavour to keep all quiet till the arrival of our friends. Were I assured of your finding them, the strangers should be dispatched this instant, but as it is possible for you to miss the banditti, I am fearful of being summoned to produce them by their domestics in the morning. And suppose either of the travellers should discover your design? Then we must poignard those in our power, and take our chance about mastering the rest. However, to avoid running such a risk, hasten to the cavern. The banditti never leave it before 11, and if you use diligence, you may reach it in time to stop them. Tell Robert that I have taken his horse. My own has broken his bridle, and escaped into the wood. What is the watchword? The reward of courage. 'Tis sufficient. I hasten to the cavern. And I to rejoin my guests, lest my absence should create suspicion. Farewell, and be diligent. These worthy associates now separated. The one bent his course towards the stable, while the other returned to the house. You may judge what must have been my feelings during this conversation, of which I lost not a single syllable. I dared not trust myself to my reflections, nor did any means present itself to escape the dangers which threatened me. Resistance I knew to be vain. I was unarmed, and a single man against 3. However, I resolved at least to sell my life as dearly as I could. Dreading lest Baptiste should perceive my absence, and suspect me to have overheard the message with which Claude was dispatched, I hastily relighted my candle and quitted the chamber. On descending, I found the table spread for 6 persons. The Baroness sat by the fireside, Marguerite was employed in dressing a salad, and her stepsons were whispering together at the further end of the room. Baptiste, having the round of the garden to make, ere he could reach the cottage door, was not yet arrived. I seated myself quietly opposite to the Baroness. A glance upon Marguerite told her that her hint had not been thrown away upon me. How different did she now appear to me! What before seemed gloom and sullenness, I now found to be disgust at her associates, and compassion for my danger. I looked up to her as to my only resource, yet knowing her to be watched by her husband with a suspicious eye, I could place but little reliance on the exertions of her goodwill. In spite of all my endeavours to conceal it, my agitation was but too visibly expressed upon my countenance. I was pale, and both my words and actions were disordered and embarrassed. The young men observed this and inquired the cause. I attributed it to excess of fatigue, and the violent effect produced on me by the severity of the season. Whether they believed me or not, I will not pretend to say. They at least ceased to embarrass me with their questions. I strove to divert my attention from the perils which surrounded me by conversing on different subjects with the Baroness. I talked of Germany, declaring my intention of visiting it immediately, God knows, that I little thought at that moment of ever seeing it. She replied to me with great ease and politeness, professed that the pleasure of making my acquaintance amply compensated for the delay in her journey, and gave me a pressing invitation to make some stay at the castle of Lindenberg. As she spoke thus, the youths exchanged a malicious smile, which declared that she would be fortunate if she ever reached that castle herself. This action did not escape me, but I concealed the emotion which it excited in my breast. I continued to converse with the lady, but my discourse was so frequently incoherent that, as she has since informed me, she began to doubt whether I was in my right senses. The fact was that while my conversation turned upon one subject, my thoughts were entirely occupied by another. I meditated upon the means of quitting the cottage, finding my way to the barn, and giving the domestics information of our host's designs. I was soon convinced how impracticable was the attempt. Jacques and Robert watched my every movement with an attentive eye, and I was obliged to abandon the idea. All my hopes now rested upon Claude's not finding the banditti. In that case, according to what I had overheard, we should be permitted to depart unhurt. I shuddered involuntarily as Baptiste entered the room. He made many apologies for his long absence, but he had been detained by affairs impossible to be delayed. He then entreated permission for his family to sup at the same table with us, without which respect would not authorize his taking such a liberty. Oh, how in my heart I cursed the hypocrite! How I loathed his presence, who was on the point of depriving me of an existence, at that time infinitely dear. I had every reason to be satisfied with life. I had youth, wealth, rank, and education, and the fairest prospects presented themselves before me. I saw those prospects on the point of closing in the most horrible manner, yet was I obliged to dissimulate, and to receive with a semblance of gratitude the false civilities of him who held the dagger to my bosom. The permission which our host demanded was easily obtained. We seated ourselves at the table. The Baroness and myself occupied one side. The sons were opposite to us with their backs to the door. Baptiste took his seat by the Baroness at the upper end, and the place next to him was left for his wife. She soon entered the room, and placed before us a plain but comfortable peasant's repast. Our host thought it necessary to apologize for the poorness of the supper. He had not been apprised of our coming, he could only offer us such fare as had been intended for his own family. But, added he, should any accident detain my noble guests longer than they at present intend, I hope to give them a better treatment. The villain! I well knew the accident to which he alluded. I shuddered at the treatment which he taught us to expect. My companion in danger seemed entirely to have got rid of her chagrin at being delayed. She laughed, and conversed with the family with infinite gaiety. I strove, but in vain, to follow her example. My spirits were evidently forced, and the constraint which I put upon myself escaped not Baptiste's observation. "Come, come, monsieur, cheer up," said he. "You seem not quite recovered from your fatigue. To raise your spirits, what say you to a glass of excellent old wine which was left me by my father? God rest his soul, he is in a better world. I seldom produce this wine, but as I am not honoured with such guests every day, this is an occasion which deserves a bottle." He then gave his wife a key, and instructed her where to find the wine of which he spoke. She seemed by no means pleased with the commission. She took the key with an embarrassed air, and hesitated to quit the table. "Did you hear me?" said Baptiste in an angry tone. Marguerite darted upon him a look of mingled anger and fear, and left the chamber. His eyes followed her suspiciously till she had closed the door. She soon returned with a bottle sealed with yellow wax. She placed it upon the table, and gave the key back to her husband. I suspected that this liquor was not presented to us without design, and I watched Marguerite's movements with inquietude. She was employed in rinsing some small horn goblets. As she placed them before Baptiste, she saw that my eye was fixed upon her, and at the moment when she thought herself unobserved by the banditti, she motioned to me with her head not to taste the liquor. She then resumed her place. In the meanwhile our host had drawn the cork, and filling 2 of the goblets, offered them to the lady and myself. She at first made some objections, but the instances of Baptiste were so urgent that she was obliged to comply. Fearing to excite suspicion, I hesitated not to take the goblet presented to me. By its smell and colour, I guessed it to be champagne, but some grains of powder floating upon the top convinced me that it was not unadulterated. However, I dared not to express my repugnance to drinking it. I lifted it to my lips and seemed to be swallowing it. Suddenly starting from my chair, I made the best of my way towards a vase of water at some distance, in which Marguerite had been rinsing the goblets. I pretended to spit out the wine with disgust, and took an opportunity unperceived of emptying the liquor into the vase. The banditti seemed alarmed at my action. Jacques half rose from his chair, put his hand into his bosom, and I discovered the haft of a dagger. I returned to my seat with tranquillity, and affected not to have observed their confusion. "You have not suited my taste, honest friend," said I, addressing myself to Baptiste. "I never can drink champagne without its producing a violent illness. I swallowed a few mouthfuls ere I was aware of its quality, and fear that I shall suffer for my imprudence." Baptiste and Jacques exchanged looks of distrust. "Perhaps," said Robert, "the smell may be disagreeable to you." He quitted his chair and removed the goblet. I observed that he examined whether it was nearly empty. "He must have drank sufficient," said he to his brother in a low voice, while he reseated himself. Marguerite looked apprehensive that I had tasted the liquor. A glance from my eye reassured her. I waited with anxiety for the effects which the beverage would produce upon the lady. I doubted not, but the grains which I had observed were poisonous, and lamented that it had been impossible for me to warn her of the danger. But a few minutes had elapsed before I perceived her eyes grow heavy. Her head sank upon her shoulder, and she fell into a deep sleep. I affected not to attend to this circumstance, and continued my conversation with Baptiste, with all the outward gaiety in my power to assume. But he no longer answered me without constraint. He eyed me with distrust and astonishment, and I saw that the banditti were frequently whispering among themselves. My situation became every moment more painful. I sustained the character of confidence with a worse grace than ever. Equally afraid of the arrival of their accomplices, and of their suspecting my knowledge of their designs, I knew not how to dissipate the distrust which the banditti evidently entertained for me. In this new dilemma, the friendly Marguerite again assisted me. She passed behind the chairs of her stepsons, stopped for a moment opposite to me, closed her eyes, and reclined her head upon her shoulder. This hint immediately dispelled my incertitude. It told me that I ought to imitate the Baroness, and pretend that the liquor had taken its full effect upon me. I did so, and in a few minutes seemed perfectly overcome with slumber. "So," cried Baptiste as I fell back in my chair, "at last he sleeps." I began to think that he had scented our design, and that we should have been forced to dispatch him at all events. "And why not dispatch him at all events?" inquired the ferocious Jacques. "Why leave him the possibility of betraying our secret? Marguerite, give me one of my pistols. A single touch of the trigger will finish him at once." "And supposing," rejoined the father, "supposing that our friends should not arrive tonight, a pretty figure we should make when the servants inquire for him in the morning." "No, no, Jacques, we must wait for our associates. If they join us, we are strong enough to dispatch the domestics as well as their masters, and the booty is our own. If Claude does not find the troop, we must take patience and suffer the prey to slip through our fingers. Ah, boys, had you arrived, but 5 minutes sooner, the Spaniard would have been done for, and 2,000 pistoles our own. But you are always out of the way when you are most wanted. You are the most unlucky rogues." "Well, well, father," answered Jacques, "had you been of my mind, all would have been over by this time. You, Robert, Claude, and myself, why, the strangers were but double the number, and I warrant you we might have mastered them. However, Claude is gone. 'Tis too late to think of it now. We must wait patiently for the arrival of the gang, and if the travellers escape us tonight, we must take care to waylay them tomorrow." "True, true," said Baptiste. "Marguerite, have you given the sleeping draught to the waiting women?" She replied in the affirmative. "All then is safe. Come, come, boys, whatever falls out, we have no reason to complain of this adventure. We run no danger, may gain much, and can lose nothing." At this moment I heard a trampling of horses. Oh, how dreadful was the sound to my ears! A cold sweat flowed down my forehead, and I felt all the terrors of impending death. I was by no means reassured by hearing the compassionate Marguerite exclaim in the accents of despair, "Almighty God! They are lost." Luckily the woodman and his sons were too much occupied by the arrival of their associates to attend to me, or the violence of my agitation would have convinced them that my sleep was feigned. "Open, open!" exclaimed several voices on the outside of the cottage. "Yes, yes!" cried Baptiste joyfully. "They are our friends sure enough. Now then, our booty is certain. Away, lads, away! Lead them to the barn, you know what is to be done there." Robert hastened to open the door of the cottage. "But first," said Jacques, taking up his arms, "first let me dispatch these sleepers." "No, no, no," replied his father. "Go you to the barn where your presence is wanted. Leave me to take care of these and the women above." Jacques obeyed and followed his brother. They seemed to converse with the newcomers for a few minutes, after which I heard the robbers dismount, and, as I conjectured, bend their course towards the barn. "So, that is wisely done," muttered Baptiste. "They have quitted their horses, that they may fall upon the strangers by surprise. Good, good, and now to business." I heard him approach a small cupboard which was fixed up in a distant part of the room, and unlock it. At this moment I felt myself shaken gently. Now, whispered Marguerite. I opened my eyes. Baptiste stood with his back towards me. No one else was in the room save Marguerite and the sleeping lady. The villain had taken a dagger from the cupboard and seemed examining whether it was sufficiently sharp. I had neglected to furnish myself with arms, but I perceived this to be my only chance of escaping, and resolved not to lose the opportunity. I sprang from my seat, darted suddenly upon Baptiste, and clasping my hands round his throat, pressed it so forcibly as to prevent his uttering a single cry. You may remember that I was remarkable at Salamanca for the power of my arm. It now rendered me an essential service. Surprised, terrified, and breathless, the villain was by no means an equal antagonist. I threw him upon the ground, I grasped him still tighter, and while I fixed him without motion upon the floor, Marguerite, wresting the dagger from his hand, plunged it repeatedly in his heart till he expired. No sooner was this horrible but necessary act perpetrated than Marguerite called on me to follow her. "Flight is our only refuge," said she. "Quick!" Quick, away. I hesitated not to obey her, but unwilling to leave the Baroness a victim to the vengeance of the robbers, I raised her in my arms, still sleeping, and hastened after Marguerite. The horses of the banditti were fastened near the door. My conductress sprang upon one of them. I followed her example, placed the Baroness before me, and spurred on my horse. Our only hope was to reach Strasbourg, which was much nearer than the perfidious Claude had assured me. Marguerite was well acquainted with the road, and galloped on before me. We were obliged to pass by the barn, where the robbers were slaughtering our domestics. The door was open, we distinguished the shrieks of the dying and imprecations of the murderers. What I felt at that moment language is unable to describe. Jacques heard the trampling of our horses as we rushed by the barn. He flew to the door with a burning torch in his hand and easily recognized the fugitives. "Betrayed! Betrayed!" he shouted to his companions. Instantly they left their bloody work and hastened to regain their horses. We heard no more. I buried my spurs in the sides of my courser, and Marguerite goaded on hers with the poignard, which had already rendered us such good service. We flew like lightning and gained the open plains. Already was Strasbourg's steeple in sight when we heard the robbers pursuing us. Marguerite looked back and distinguished our followers descending a small hill at no great distance. It was in vain that we urged on our horses. The noise approached nearer with every moment. "We are lost," she exclaimed. "The villains gain upon us." "On, on," replied I. "I hear the trampling of horses coming from the town." We redoubled our exertions, and were soon aware of a numerous band of cavaliers who came towards us at full speed. They were on the point of passing us. "Stay, stay!" shrieked Marguerite. "Save us!" "For God's sake, save us!" The foremost, who seemed to act as guide, immediately reined in his steed. "'Tis she, 'tis she!" exclaimed he, springing upon the ground. "Stop, my lord, stop!" "They are safe. 'Tis my mother." At the same moment Marguerite threw herself from her horse, clasped him in her arms, and covered him with kisses. The other cavaliers stopped at the exclamation. "The Baroness Lindenberg?" cried another of the strangers eagerly. "Where is she? Is she not with you?" He stopped on beholding her lying senseless in my arms. Hastily he caught her from me. The profound sleep in which she was plunged made him at first tremble for her life, but the beating of her heart soon reassured him. "God be thanked," said he, "she has escaped unhurt." I interrupted his joy by pointing out the brigands, who continued to approach. No sooner had I mentioned them than the greatest part of the company, which appeared to be chiefly composed of soldiers, hastened forward to meet them. The villains stayed not to receive their attack. Perceiving their danger, they turned the heads of their horses and fled into the wood, whither they were followed by our preservers. In the meanwhile the stranger, whom I guessed to be the Baron Lindenberg, after thanking me for my care of his lady, proposed our returning with all speed to the town. The Baroness, on whom the effects of the opiate had not ceased to operate, was placed before him. Marguerite and her son remounted their horses. The Baron's domestics followed, and we soon arrived at the inn, where he had taken his apartments. This was at the Austrian Eagle, where my banker, whom before my quitting Paris I had apprised of my intention to visit Strasbourg, had prepared lodgings for me. I rejoiced at this circumstance. It gave me an opportunity of cultivating the Baron's acquaintance, which I foresaw would be of use to me in Germany. Immediately upon our arrival, the lady was conveyed to bed. A physician was sent for, who prescribed a medicine likely to counteract the effects of the sleepy potion, and after it had been poured down her throat, she was committed to the care of the hostess. The Baron then addressed himself to me, and entreated me to recount the particulars of this adventure. I complied with his request instantaneously, for in pain respecting Stefano's fate, whom I had been compelled to abandon to the cruelty of the banditti, I found it impossible for me to repose till I had some news of him. I received but too soon the intelligence that my trusty servant had perished. The soldiers who had pursued the brigands returned while I was employed in relating my adventure to the Baron. By their account, I found that the robbers had been overtaken. Guilt and true courage are incompatible. They had thrown themselves at the feet of their pursuers, had surrendered themselves without striking a blow, had discovered their secret retreat, made known their signals by which the rest of the gang might be seized, and in short had betrayed every mark of cowardice and baseness. By this means the whole of the band, consisting of near 60 persons, had been made prisoners, bound, and conducted to Strasbourg. Some of the soldiers hastened to the cottage, one of the banditti serving them as guide. Their first visit was to the fatal barn, where they were fortunate enough to find 2 of the Baron's servants still alive, though desperately wounded. The rest had expired beneath the swords of the robbers, and of these my unhappy Stefano was one. Alarmed at our escape, the robbers, in their haste to overtake us, had neglected to visit the cottage. In consequence, the soldiers found the 2 waiting, women unhurt, and buried in the same death-like slumber which had overpowered their mistress. There was nobody else found in the cottage, except a child not above 4 years old, which the soldiers brought away with them. We were busying ourselves with conjectures respecting the birth of this little unfortunate, when Marguerite rushed into the room with the baby in her arms. She fell at the feet of the officer who was making us this report, and blessed him 1,000 times for the preservation of her child. When the first burst of maternal tenderness was over, I besought her to declare by what means she had been united to a man whose principles seemed so totally discordant with her own. She bent her eyes downwards and wiped a few tears from her cheek. "Gentlemen," said she, after a silence of some minutes, "I would request a favour of you. You have a right to know on whom you confer an obligation. I will not therefore stifle a confession which covers me with shame, but permit me to comprise it in as few words as possible. I was born in Strasbourg of respectable parents. Their names I must at present conceal. My father still lives, and deserves not to be involved in my infamy. If you grant my request, you shall be informed of my family name. A villain made himself master of my affections, and to follow him I quitted my father's house. Yet though my passions overpowered my virtue, I sank not into that degeneracy of vice, but too commonly the lot of women who make the first false step. I loved my seducer, dearly loved him. I was true to his bed, this baby, and the youth who warned you, my Lord Baron, of your lady's danger, are the pledges of our affection. Even at this moment I lament his loss, though 'tis to him that I owe all the miseries of my existence. He was of noble birth, but he had squandered away his paternal inheritance. His relations considered him as a disgrace to their name, and utterly discarded him. His excesses drew upon him the indignation of the police. He was obliged to fly from Strasbourg, and saw no other resource from beggary than an union with the banditti who infested the neighbouring forest, and whose troop was chiefly composed of young men of family in the same predicament with himself. I was determined not to forsake him. I followed him to the cavern of the brigands, and shared with him the misery inseparable from a life of pillage. But though I was aware that our existence was supported by plunder, I knew not all the horrible circumstances attached to my lover's profession. These he concealed from me with the utmost care. He was conscious that my sentiments were not sufficiently depraved to look without horror upon assassination, he supposed, and with justice, that I should fly with detestation from the embraces of a murderer. 8 years of possession had not abated his love for me, and he cautiously removed from my knowledge every circumstance which might lead me to suspect the crimes in which he but too often participated. He succeeded perfectly. It was not till after my seducer's death that I discovered his hands to have been stained with the blood of innocence. One fatal night he was brought back to the cavern covered with wounds. He received them in attacking an English traveller, whom his companions immediately sacrificed to their resentment. He had only time to entreat my pardon for all the sorrows which he had caused me. He pressed my hand to his lips and expired. My grief was inexpressible. As soon as its violence abated, I resolved to return to Strasbourg, to throw myself with my 2 children at my father's feet, and implore his forgiveness, though I little hoped to obtain it. What was my consternation when informed that no one entrusted with the secret of their retreat was ever permitted to quit the troop of the banditti, that I must give up all hopes of ever rejoining society, and consent instantly to accepting one of their band for my husband. My prayers and remonstrances were vain. They cast lots to decide to whose possession I should fall. I became the property of the infamous Baptiste. A robber, who had once been a monk, pronounced over us a burlesque rather than a religious ceremony. I and my children were delivered into the hands of my new husband, and he conveyed us immediately to his home. He assured me that he had long entertained for me the most ardent regard, but that friendship for my deceased lover had obliged him to stifle his desires. He endeavoured to reconcile me to my fate, and for some time treated me with respect and gentleness. At length, finding that my aversion rather increased than diminished, he obtained those favours by violence which I persisted to refuse him. No resource remained for me but to bear my sorrows with patience. I was conscious that I deserved them but too well. Flight was forbidden, my children were in the power of Baptiste, and he had sworn that if I attempted to escape, their lives should pay for it. I had had too many opportunities of witnessing the barbarity of his nature to doubt his fulfilling his oath to the very letter. Sad experience had convinced me of the horrors of my situation. My first lover had carefully concealed them from me. Baptiste rather rejoiced in opening my eyes to the cruelties of his profession, and strove to familiarize me with blood and slaughter. My nature was licentious and warm, but not cruel. My conduct had been imprudent, but my heart was not unprincipled. Judge then what I must have felt at being a continual witness of crimes the most horrible and revolting. Judge how I must have grieved at being united to a man who received the unsuspecting guest with an air of openness and hospitality at the very moment that he meditated his destruction. Chagrin and discontent preyed upon my constitution. The few charms bestowed on me by nature withered away, and the dejection of my countenance denoted the sufferings of my heart. I was tempted 1,000 times to put an end to my existence, but the remembrance of my children held my hand. I trembled to leave my dear boys in my tyrant's power, and trembled yet more for their virtue than their lives. The second was still too young to benefit by my instructions, but in the heart of my eldest I laboured unceasingly to plant those principles which might enable him to avoid the crimes of his parents. He listened to me with docility, or rather with eagerness. Even at his early age, he showed that he was not calculated for the society of villains, and the only comfort which I enjoyed among my sorrows was to witness the dawning virtues of my Theodore. Such was my situation, when the perfidy of Don Alfonso's postilion conducted him to the cottage. His youth, air, and manners interested me most forcibly in his behalf. The absence of my husband's sons gave me an opportunity which I had long wished to find, and I resolved to risk everything to preserve the stranger. The vigilance of Baptiste prevented me from warning Don Alfonso of his danger. I knew that my betraying the secret would be immediately punished with death, and however embittered was my life by calamities, I wanted courage to sacrifice it for the sake of preserving that of another person. My only hope rested upon procuring succour from Strasbourg. At this I resolved to try, and should an opportunity offer of warning Don Alfonso of his danger unobserved, I was determined to seize it with avidity. By Baptiste's orders I went upstairs to make the stranger's bed. I spread upon it sheets in which a traveller had been murdered but a few nights before, and which still were stained with blood. I hoped that these marks would not escape the vigilance of our guest, and that he would collect from them the designs of my perfidious husband. Neither was this the only step which I took to preserve the stranger. Theodore was confined to his bed by illness. I stole into his room unobserved by my tyrant, communicated to him my project, and he entered into it with eagerness. He rose in spite of his malady, and dressed himself with all speed. I fastened one of the sheets round his arms, and lowered him from the window. He flew to the stable, took Claude's horse, and hastened to Strasbourg. Had he been accosted by the banditti, he was to have declared himself sent upon a message by Baptiste, but fortunately he reached the town without meeting any obstacle. Immediately upon his arrival at Strasbourg, he entreated assistance from the magistrature. His story passed from mouth to mouth, and at length came to the knowledge of my lord the Baron. Anxious for the safety of his lady, whom he knew would be upon the road that evening, it struck him that she might have fallen into the power of the robbers. He accompanied Theodore, who guided the soldiers towards the cottage, and arrived just in time to save us from falling once more into the hands of our enemies. Here I interrupted Marguerite to inquire why the sleepy potion had been presented to me. She said that Baptiste supposed me to have arms about me, and wished to incapacitate me from making resistance. It was a precaution which he always took, since as the travellers had no hopes of escaping, despair would have incited them to sell their lives dearly. The Baron then desired Marguerite to inform him what were her present plans. I joined him in declaring my readiness to show my gratitude to her for the preservation of my life. Disgusted with a world, she replied, in which I have met with nothing but misfortunes, my only wish is to retire into a convent. But first, I must provide for my children. I find that my mother is no more, probably driven to an untimely grave by my desertion. My father is still living, he is not an hard man. Perhaps, gentlemen, in spite of my ingratitude and imprudence, your intercessions may induce him to forgive me and to take charge of his unfortunate grandsons. If you obtain this boon for me, you will repay my services 1,000-fold. Both the Baron and myself assured Marguerite that we would spare no pains to obtain her pardon, and that even should her father be inflexible, she need be under no apprehensions respecting the fate of her children. I engaged myself to provide for Theodore, and the Baron promised to take the youngest under his protection. The grateful mother thanked us with tears for what she called generosity, but which in fact was no more than a proper sense of our obligations to her. She then left the room to put her little boy to bed, whom fatigue and sleep had completely overpowered. The Baroness, on recovering and being informed from what dangers I had rescued her, set no bounds to the expressions of her gratitude. She was joined so warmly by her husband in pressing me to accompany them to their castle in Bavaria that I found it impossible to resist their entreaties. During the week which we passed at Strasbourg, the interests of Marguerite were not forgotten. In our application to her father we succeeded as amply as we could wish. The good old man had lost his wife. He had no children but this unfortunate daughter, of whom he had received no news for almost 14 years. He was surrounded by distant relations, who waited with impatience for his decease in order to get possession of his money. When therefore Marguerite appeared again so unexpectedly, he considered her as a gift from heaven. He received her and her children with open arms, and insisted upon their establishing themselves in his house without delay. The disappointed cousins were obliged to give place. The old man would not hear of his daughter's retiring into a convent. He said that she was too necessary to his happiness, and she was easily persuaded to relinquish her design. But no persuasions could induce Theodore to give up the plan which I had at first marked out for him. He had attached himself to me most sincerely during my stay at Strasbourg, and when I was on the point of leaving it, he besought me with tears to take him into my service. He set forth all his little talents in the most favourable colours, and tried to convince me that I should find him of infinite use to me upon the road. I was unwilling to charge myself with a lad, but scarcely turned of 13, whom I knew could only be a burthen to me. However, I could not resist the entreaties of this affectionate youth, who in fact possessed 1,000 estimable qualities. With some difficulty, he persuaded his relations to let him follow me, and that permission once obtained, he was dubbed with the title of my page. Having passed a week at Strasbourg, Theodore and myself set out for Bavaria in company with the Baron and his lady. These latter, as well as myself, had forced Marguerite to accept several presents of value, both for herself and her youngest son, on leaving her. I promised his mother faithfully that I would restore Theodore to her within the year. I have related this adventure at length, Lorenzo, that you might understand the means by which the adventurer, Alfonso d'Alvarado, got introduced into the castle of Lindenberg. Judge from this specimen how much faith should be given to your aunt's assertions. Chapter 4. Avaunt, and quit my sight, let the earth hide thee, thy bones are marrowless, thy blood is cold, thou hast no speculation in those eyes which thou dost glare with, hence horrible shadow, unreal mockery, hence Macbeth. Continuation of the history of Don Raymond. My journey was uncommonly agreeable. I found the Baron a man of some sense, but little knowledge of the world. He had passed a great part of his life without stirring beyond the precincts of his own domains, and consequently his manners were far from being the most polished, but he was hearty, good-humoured, and friendly. His attention to me was all that I could wish, and I had every reason to be satisfied with his behaviour. His ruling passion was hunting, which he had brought himself to consider as a serious occupation, and when talking over some remarkable chase, he treated the subject with as much gravity as it had been a battle on which the fate of 2 kingdoms was depending. I happened to be a tolerable sportsman. Soon after my arrival at Lindenberg, I gave some proofs of my dexterity. The Baron immediately marked me down for a man of genius, and vowed to me an eternal friendship. That friendship was become to me by no means indifferent. At the castle of Lindenberg, I beheld for the first time your sister, the lovely Agnes. For me, whose heart was unoccupied, and who grieved at the void, to see her and to love her were the same. I found in Agnes all that was requisite to secure my affection. She was then scarcely 16, her person light and elegant was already formed. She possessed several talents in perfection, particularly those of music and drawing. Her character was gay, open and good-humoured, and the graceful simplicity of her dress and manners formed an advantageous contrast to the art and studied coquetry of the Parisian dames whom I had just quitted. From the moment that I beheld her, I felt the most lively interest in her fate. I made many inquiries respecting her of the Baroness. "She is my niece," replied that lady. "You are still ignorant, Don Alfonso, that I am your countrywoman. I am sister to the Duke of Medina Celi. Agnes is the daughter of my second brother, Don Gaston. She has been destined to the convent from her cradle, and will soon make her profession at Madrid." Here Lorenzo interrupted the Marquis by an exclamation of surprise. "Intended for the convent from her cradle," said he. "By heaven, this is the first word that I ever heard of such a design." "I believe it, my dear Lorenzo," answered Don Raymond, "but you must listen to me with patience. You will not be less surprised when I relate some particulars of your family still unknown to you, and which I have learnt from the mouth of Agnes herself." He then resumed his narrative as follows. "You cannot but be aware that your parents were unfortunately slaves to the grossest superstition, when this foible was called into play. Their every other sentiment, their every other passion yielded to its irresistible strength. While she was big with Agnes, your mother was seized by a dangerous illness, and given over by her physicians. In this situation, Donna Inesilla vowed that if she recovered from her malady, the child then living in her bosom, if a girl should be dedicated to Saint Clare, if a boy to Saint Benedict. Her prayers were heard, she got rid of her complaint. Agnes entered the world alive, and was immediately destined to the service of Saint Clare. Don Gaston readily chimed in with his lady's wishes, but knowing the sentiments of the Duke, his brother, respecting a monastic life, it was determined that your sister's destination should be carefully concealed from him. The better to guard the secret, it was resolved that Agnes should accompany her aunt, Donna Rodolpha, into Germany, whither that lady was on the point of following her new married husband, Baron Lindenberg. On her arrival at that estate, the young Agnes was put into a convent, situated but a few miles from the castle. The nuns to whom her education was confided performed their charge with exactitude. They made her a perfect mistress of many talents, and strove to infuse into her mind a taste for the retirement and tranquil pleasures of a convent. But a secret instinct made the young recluse sensible that she was not born for solitude. In all the freedom of youth and gaiety, she scrupled not to treat as ridiculous many ceremonies which the nuns regarded with awe, and she was never more happy than when her lively imagination inspired her with some scheme to plague the stiff lady abbess or the ugly, ill-tempered old porteress. She looked with disgust upon the prospect before her, however no alternative was offered to her, and she submitted to the decree of her parents, though not without secret repining. That repugnance she had not art enough to conceal long. Don Gaston was informed of it. Alarmed, Lorenzo, lest your affection for her should oppose itself to his projects, and lest you should positively object to your sister's misery, he resolved to keep the whole affair from your knowledge, as well as the Duke's, till the sacrifice should be consummated. The season of her taking the veil was fixed for the time when you should be upon your travels. In the meanwhile, no hint was dropped of Donna Inesilla's fatal vow. Your sister was never permitted to know your direction. All your letters were read before she received them, and those parts effaced, which were likely to nourish her inclination for the world. Her answers were dictated either by her aunt or by Dame Cunegonda, her governess. These particulars I learned partly from Agnes, partly from the Baroness herself. I immediately determined upon rescuing this lovely girl from a fate so contrary to her inclinations and ill-suited to her merit. I endeavoured to ingratiate myself into her favour. I boasted of my friendship and intimacy with you. She listened to me with avidity. She seemed to devour my words while I spoke in your praise, and her eyes thanked me for my affection to her brother. My constant and unremitted attention at length gained me her heart, and with difficulty I obliged her to confess that she loved me. When, however, I proposed her quitting the castle of Lindenberg, she rejected the idea in positive terms. "Be generous, Alfonso," she said. "You possess my heart, but use not the gift ignobly. Employ not your ascendancy over me in persuading me to take a step at which I should hereafter have to blush. I am young and deserted, my brother, my only friend is separated from me, and my other relations act with me as my enemies. Take pity on my unprotected situation. Instead of seducing me to an action which would cover me with shame, strive rather to gain the affections of those who govern me. The Baron esteems you. My aunt, to others ever harsh, proud, and contemptuous, remembers that you rescued her from the hands of murderers, and wears with you alone the appearance of kindness and benignity. Try then your influence over my guardians. If they consent to our union, my hand is yours. From your account of my brother, I cannot doubt your obtaining his approbation, and when they find the impossibility of executing their design, I trust that my parents would excuse my disobedience and expiate by some other sacrifice my mother's fatal vow. From the first moment that I beheld Agnes, I had endeavoured to conciliate the favour of her relations. Authorised by the confession of her regard, I redoubled my exertions. My principal battery was directed against the Baroness. It was easy to discover that her word was law in the castle. Her husband paid her the most absolute submission and considered her as a superior being. She was about 40. In her youth she had been a beauty, but her charms had been upon that large scale which can but ill sustain the shock of years. However, she still possessed some remains of them. Her understanding was strong and excellent when not obscured by prejudice, which unluckily was but seldom the case. Her passions were violent. She spared no pains to gratify them, and pursued with unremitting vengeance those who opposed themselves to her wishes. The warmest of friends, the most inveterate of enemies, such was the Baroness Lindenberg. I laboured incessantly to please her. Unluckily, I succeeded but too well. She seemed gratified by my attention, and treated me with a distinction accorded by her to no one else. One of my daily occupations was reading to her for several hours. Those hours I should much rather have passed with Agnes. But as I was conscious that complaisance for her aunt would advance our union, I submitted with a good grace to the penance imposed upon me. Donna Rodolfo's library was principally composed of old Spanish romances. These were her favourite studies, and once a day one of these unmerciful volumes was put regularly into my hands. I read the wearisome adventures of Perceforest, Tyrant the White, Palmerin of England, and the Knight of the Sun, till the book was on the point of falling from my hands through ennui. However, the increasing pleasure which the Baroness seemed to take in my society encouraged me to persevere, and latterly she showed for me a partiality so marked that Agnes advised me to seize the first opportunity of declaring our mutual passion to her aunt. One evening, I was alone with Donna Rodolfo in her own apartment. As our readings generally treated of love, Agnes was never permitted to assist at them. I was just congratulating myself on having finished The Loves of Tristan and the Queen Iseult. "Ah, the unfortunates!" cried the Baroness. "How say you, Señor? Do you think it possible for man to feel an attachment so disinterested and sincere?" "I cannot doubt it," replied I. "My own heart furnishes me with the certainty." "Ah, Donna Rodolfo, might I but hope for your approbation of my love, might I but confess the name of my mistress without incurring your resentment." She interrupted me. "Suppose I were to spare you that confession. Suppose I were to acknowledge that the object of your desires is not unknown to me. Suppose I were to say that she returns your affection, and laments not less sincerely than yourself the unhappy vows which separate her from you." "Ah, Donna Rodolfo!" I exclaimed, throwing myself upon my knees before her and pressing her hand to my lips. "You have discovered my secret. What is your decision? Must I despair, or may I reckon upon your favour?" She withdrew not the hand which I held, but she turned from me and covered her face with the other. "How can I refuse it you?" she replied. "Ah, Don Alfonso, I have long perceived to whom your attentions were directed, but till now I perceive not the impression which they made upon my heart. At length I can no longer hide my weakness either from myself or from you. I yield to the violence of my passion, and own that I adore you. For 3 long months I stifled my desires, but grown stronger by resistance, I submit to their impetuosity. Pride, fear, and honour, respect for myself, and my engagements to the Baron, all are vanquished. I sacrifice them to my love for you, and it still seems to me that I pay too mean a price for your possession." She paused for an answer. Judge, my Lorenzo, what must have been my confusion at this discovery. I at once saw all the magnitude of this obstacle, which I had raised myself to my happiness. The Baroness had placed those attentions to her own account, which I had merely paid her for the sake of Agnes, and the strength of her expressions, the looks which accompanied them, and my knowledge of her revengeful disposition made me tremble for myself and my beloved. I was silent for some minutes. I knew not how to reply to her declaration. I could only resolve to clear up the mistake without delay, and for the present to conceal from her knowledge the name of my mistress. No sooner had she avowed her passion than the transports which before were evident in my features gave place to consternation and constraint. I dropped her hand and rose from my knees. The change in my countenance did not escape her observation. "What means this silence?" said she in a trembling voice. "Where is that joy which you led me to expect?" "Forgive me, Signora," I answered, "if what necessity forces from me should seem harsh and ungrateful, to encourage you in an error, which, however it may flatter myself, must prove to you the source of disappointment, would make me appear criminal in every eye. Honour obliges me to inform you that you have mistaken for the solicitude of love what was only the attention of friendship. The latter sentiment is that which I wished to excite in your bosom. To entertain a warmer respect for you forbids me, and gratitude for the Baron's generous treatment. Perhaps these reasons would not be sufficient to shield me from your attractions, were it not that my affections are already bestowed upon another. You have charms, Senora, which might captivate the most insensible. No heart unoccupied could resist them. Happy is it for me that mine is no longer in my possession, or I should have to reproach myself for ever with having violated the laws of hospitality. Recollect yourself, noble lady, recollect what is owed by you to honour, by me to the Baron, and replace by esteem and friendship those sentiments which I never can return." The Baroness turned pale at this unexpected and positive declaration. She doubted whether she slept or woke. At length, recovering from her surprise, consternation gave place to rage, and the blood rushed back into her cheeks with violence. "Villain!" she cried, "monster of deceit! Thus is the avowal of my love received. Is it thus that— But no, no, it cannot, it shall not be. Alfonso, behold me at your feet, be witness of my despair. Look with pity on a woman who loves you with sincere affection. She who possesses your heart, how has she merited such a treasure? What sacrifice has she made to you? What raises her above Rodolpha?" I endeavoured to lift her from her knees. "For God's sake, Senora, restrain these transports. They disgrace yourself and me. Your exclamations may be heard, and your secret divulged to your attendants. I see that my presence only irritates you. Permit me to retire." I prepared to quit the apartment. The Baroness caught me suddenly by the arm. "And who is this happy rival?" said she in a menacing tone. "I will know her name, and when I know it. She is someone in my power. You entreated my favour, my protection. Let me but find her. Let me but know who dares to rob me of your heart, and she shall suffer every torment which jealousy and disappointment can inflict. Who is she? Answer me this moment. Hope not to conceal her from my vengeance. Spies shall be set over you, every step, every look shall be watched. Your eyes will discover my rival, I shall know her, and when she is found, tremble, Alfonso, for her and for yourself." As she uttered these last words, her fury mounted to such a pitch as to stop her powers of respiration. She panted, groaned, and at length fainted away. As she was falling, I caught her in my arms and placed her upon a sofa. Then, hastening to the door, I summoned her women to her assistance. I committed her to their care, and seized the opportunity of escaping. Agitated and confused beyond expression, I bent my steps towards the garden. The benignity with which the Baroness had listened to me at first raised my hopes to the highest pitch. I imagined her to have perceived my attachment for her niece, and to approve of it. Extreme was my disappointment at understanding the true purport of her discourse. I knew not what course to take. The superstition of the parents of Agnes, aided by her aunt's unfortunate passion, seemed to oppose such obstacles to our union as were almost insurmountable. As I passed by a low parlour, whose windows looked into the garden, through the door which stood half open, I observed Agnes seated at a table. She was occupied in drawing, and several unfinished sketches were scattered round her. I entered, still undetermined whether I should acquaint her with the declaration of the Baroness. "Oh, is it only you?" said she, raising her head. "You are no stranger, and I shall continue my occupation without ceremony. Take a chair, and seat yourself by me." I obeyed, and placed myself near the table. Unconscious what I was doing, and totally occupied by the scene which had just passed, I took up some of the drawings and cast my eye over them. One of the subjects struck me from its singularity. It represented the great hall of the castle of Lindenberg. A door conducting to a narrow staircase stood half open. In the foreground appeared a group of figures placed in the most grotesque attitudes. Terror was expressed upon every countenance. Here was one upon his knees, with his eyes cast up to heaven, and praying most devoutly. There another was creeping away upon all fours. Some hid their faces in their cloaks or the laps of their companions. Some had concealed themselves beneath a table on which the remnants of a feast were visible, while others, with gaping mouths and eyes wide, stretched pointed to a figure, supposed to have created this disturbance. It represented a female of more than human stature, clothed in the habit of some religious order. Her face was veiled. On her arm hung a chaplet of beads. Her dress was in several places stained with the blood which trickled from a wound upon her bosom. In one hand she held a lamp, in the other a large knife, and she seemed advancing towards the iron gates of the hall. "What does this mean, Agnes?" said I. "Is this some invention of your own?" She cast her eye upon the drawing. "Oh, no," she replied, "'tis the invention of much wiser heads than mine. But can you possibly have lived at Lindenberg for 3 whole months without hearing of the bleeding nun? You are the first who ever mentioned the name to me. Pray, who may the lady be?" "That is more than I can pretend to tell you. All my knowledge of her history comes from an old tradition in this family, which has been handed down from father to son, and is firmly credited throughout the Baron's domains. Nay, the Baron believes it himself, and as for my aunt, who has a natural turn for the marvellous, she would sooner doubt the veracity of the Bible than of the bleeding nun. Shall I tell you this history?" I answered that she would oblige me much by relating it. She resumed her drawing, and then proceeded as follows in a tone of burlesqued gravity. "It is surprising that in all the chronicles of past times this remarkable personage is never once mentioned. Fain would I recount to you her life, but unluckily till after her death she was never known to have existed. Then first did she think it necessary to make some noise in the world, and with that intention she made bold to seize upon the castle of Lindenberg. Having a good taste, she took up her abode in the best room of the house, and once established there, she began to amuse herself by knocking about the tables and chairs in the middle of the night. Perhaps she was a bad sleeper, but this I have never been able to ascertain. According to the tradition, this entertainment commenced about a century ago. It was accompanied with shrieking, howling, groaning, swearing, and many other agreeable noises of the same kind. But though one particular room was more especially honoured with her visits, she did not entirely confine herself to it. She occasionally ventured into the old galleries, paced up and down the spacious halls, or sometimes stopping at the doors of the chambers. She wept and wailed there to the universal terror of the inhabitants. In these nocturnal excursions she was seen by different people, who all describe her appearance as you behold it here, traced by the hand of her unworthy historian. The singularity of this account insensibly engaged my attention. "Did she never speak to those who met her?" said I. "Not she. The specimens, indeed, which she gave nightly of her talents for conversation, were by no means inviting. Sometimes the castle rung with oaths and execrations a moment after she repeated her paternoster. Now she howled out the most horrible blasphemies, and then chaunted de profundis as orderly as if still in the choir. In short, she seemed a mighty capricious being, but whether she prayed or cursed, whether she was impious or devout, she always contrived to terrify her auditors out of their senses. The castle became scarcely habitable, and its lord was so frightened by these midnight revels that one fine morning he was found dead in his bed. This success seemed to please the nun mightily, for now she made more noise than ever, but the next baron proved too cunning for her. He made his appearance with a celebrated exorciser in his hand, who feared not to shut himself up for a night in the haunted chamber. There it seems that he had an hard battle with the ghost before she would promise to be quiet. She was obstinate, but he was more so, and at length she consented to let the inhabitants of the castle take a good night's rest. For some time after no news was heard of her. But at the end of 5 years the exorciser died, and then the nun ventured to peep abroad again. However, she was now grown much more tractable and well behaved. She walked about in silence, and never made her appearance above once in 5 years. This custom, if you will believe the Baron, she still continues. He is fully persuaded that on the 5th of May of every 5th year, as soon as the clock strikes 1, the door of the haunted chamber opens. Observe that this room has been shut up for near a century. Then out walks the ghostly nun with her lamp and dagger. She descends the staircase of the eastern tower and crosses the great hall. On that night the porter always leaves the gates of the castle open, out of respect to the apparition, not that this is thought by any means necessary, since she could easily whip through the keyhole if she chose it, but merely out of politeness, and to prevent her from making her exit in a way so derogatory to the dignity of her ghostship. And whither does she go on quitting the castle? To heaven, I hope. But if she does, the place certainly is not to her taste, for she always returns after an hour's absence. The lady then retires to her chamber and is quiet for another 5 years. "And you believe this, Agnes? How can you ask such a question?" "No, no, Alfonso. I have too much reason to lament superstition's influence to be its victim myself. However, I must not avow my incredulity to the Baroness. She entertains not a doubt of the truth of this history. As to Dame Cunegonda, my governess, she protests that 15 years ago she saw the spectre with her own eyes. She related to me one evening how she and several other domestics had been terrified while at supper by the appearance of the bleeding nun, as the ghost is called in the castle. 'Tis from her account that I drew this sketch, and you may be certain that Cunegonda was not omitted. There she is. I shall never forget what a passion she was in, and how ugly she looked while she scolded me for having made her picture so like herself." Here she pointed to a burlesque figure of an old woman in an attitude of terror. In spite of the melancholy which oppressed me, I could not help smiling at the playful imagination of Agnes. She had perfectly preserved Dame Cunegonda's resemblance, but had so much exaggerated every fault, and rendered every feature so irresistibly laughable, that I could easily conceive the duenna's anger. "The figure is admirable, my dear Agnes. I knew not that you possessed such talents for the ridiculous." "Stay a moment," she replied. "I will show you a figure still more ridiculous than Dame Cunegonda's. If it pleases you, you may dispose of it as seems best to yourself." She rose and went to a cabinet at some little distance. Unlocking a drawer, she took out a small case, which she opened and presented to me. "Do you know the resemblance?" said she, smiling. It was her own. Transported at the gift, I pressed the portrait to my lips with passion. I threw myself at her feet and declared my gratitude in the warmest and most affectionate terms. She listened to me with complaisance and assured me that she shared my sentiments, when suddenly she uttered a loud shriek, disengaged the hand which I held, and flew from the room by a door which opened to the garden. Amazed at this abrupt departure, I rose hastily from my knees. I beheld with confusion the Baroness standing near me, glowing with jealousy and almost choked with rage. On recovering from her swoon, she had tortured her imagination to discover her concealed rival. No one appeared to deserve her suspicions more than Agnes. She immediately hastened to find her niece, tax her with encouraging my addresses, and assure herself whether her conjectures were well grounded. Unfortunately, she had already seen enough to need no other confirmation. She arrived at the door of the room at the precise moment when Agnes gave me her portrait. She heard me profess an everlasting attachment to her rival and saw me kneeling at her feet. She advanced to separate us. We were too much occupied by each other to perceive her approach, and were not aware of it, till Agnes beheld her standing by my side. Rage on the part of Donna Rodolpha, embarrassment on mine, for some time kept us both silent. The lady recovered herself first. "My suspicions then were just," said she. "The coquetry of my niece has triumphed, and 'tis to her that I am sacrificed. In one respect, however, I am fortunate. I shall not be the only one who laments a disappointed passion. You too shall know what it is to love without hope. I daily expect orders for restoring Agnes to her parents. Immediately upon her arrival in Spain, she will take the veil and place an insuperable barrier to your union. You may spare your supplications," she continued, perceiving me on the point of speaking. "My resolution is fixed and immovable. Your mistress shall remain a close prisoner in her chamber till she exchanges this castle for the cloister. Solitude will perhaps recall her to a sense of her duty, but to prevent your opposing that wished event, I must inform you, Don Alfonso, that your presence here is no longer agreeable either to the Baron or myself. It was not to talk nonsense to my niece that your relations sent you to Germany. Your business was to travel, and I should be sorry to impede any longer so excellent a design. Farewell, Señor. Remember that tomorrow morning we meet for the last time." Having said this, she darted upon me a look of pride, contempt, and malice, and quitted the apartment. I also retired to mine, and consumed the night in planning the means of rescuing Agnes from the power of her tyrannical aunt. After the positive declaration of its mistress, it was impossible for me to make a longer stay at the castle of Lindenberg. Accordingly, I, the next day, announced my immediate departure. The Baron declared that it gave him sincere pain, and he expressed himself in my favour so warmly that I endeavoured to win him over to my interest. Scarcely had I mentioned the name of Agnes when he stopped me short and said that it was totally out of his power to interfere in the business. I saw that it was in vain to argue. The Baroness governed her husband with despotic sway, and I easily perceived that she had prejudiced him against the match. Agnes did not appear. I entreated permission to take leave of her, but my prayer was rejected. I was obliged to depart without seeing her. At quitting him, the Baron shook my hand affectionately and assured me that as soon as his niece was gone, I might consider his house as my own. "Farewell, Don Alfonso," said the Baroness, and stretched out her hand to me. I took it and offered to carry it to my lips. She prevented me. Her husband was at the other end of the room and out of hearing. "Take care of yourself," she continued. "My love is become hatred, and my wounded pride shall not be unatoned. Go where you will, my vengeance shall follow you." She accompanied these words with a look sufficient to make me tremble. I answered not, but hastened to quit the castle. As my chaise drove out of the court, I looked up to the windows of your sister's chamber. Nobody was to be seen there. I threw myself back despondent in my carriage. I was attended by no other servants than a Frenchman whom I had hired at Strasbourg in Stefano's room, and my little page whom I before mentioned to you. The fidelity, intelligence, and good temper of Theodore had already made him dear to me, but he now prepared to lay an obligation on me which made me look upon him as a guardian genius. Scarcely had we proceeded half a mile from the castle when he rode up to the chaise door. "Take courage, Señor," said he in Spanish, which he had already learnt to speak with fluency and correctness. "While you were with the Baron, I watched the moment when Dame Cunegonda was below stairs and mounted into the chamber over that of Donna Agnes. I sang as loud as I could a little German air well known to her, hoping that she would recollect my voice. I was not disappointed, for I soon heard her window open. I hastened to let down a string with which I had provided myself. Upon hearing the casement closed again, I drew up the string, and fastened to it. I found this scrap of paper. He then presented me with a small note addressed to me. I opened it with impatience. It contained the following words written in pencil: "Conceal yourself for the next fortnight in some neighbouring village. My aunt will believe you to have quitted Lindenberg, and I shall be restored to liberty. I will be in the West Pavilion at 12 on the night of the 30th. Fail not to be there, and we shall have an opportunity of concerting our future plans. Adieu, Agnes." At perusing these lines, my transports exceeded all bounds. Neither did I set any to the expressions of gratitude which I heaped upon Theodore. In fact, his address and attention merited my warmest praise. You will readily believe that I had not entrusted him with my passion for Agnes, but the arch youth had too much discernment not to discover my secret, and too much discretion not to conceal his knowledge of it. He observed in silence what was going on, nor strove to make himself an agent in the business till my interests required his interference. I equally admired his judgment, his penetration, his address, and his fidelity. This was not the first occasion in which I had found him of infinite use, and I was every day more convinced of his quickness and capacity. During my short stay at Strasbourg, he had applied himself diligently to learning the rudiments of Spanish. He continued to study it, and with so much success that he spoke it with the same facility as his native language. He passed the greatest part of his time in reading. He had acquired much information for his age, and united the advantages of a lively countenance and prepossessing figure to an excellent understanding and the very best of hearts. He is now 15. He is still in my service, and when you see him, I am sure that he will please you. But excuse this digression. I return to the subject which I quitted. I obeyed the instructions of Agnes. I proceeded to Munich. There I left my chaise under the care of Lucas, my French servant, and then returned on horseback to a small village about 4 miles distant from the castle of Lindenberg. Upon arriving, there a story was related to the host at whose inn I descended, which prevented his wondering at my making so long a stay in his house. The old man, fortunately, was credulous and incurious. He believed all I said, and sought to know no more than what I thought proper to tell him. Nobody was with me but Theodore. Both were disguised, and as we kept ourselves close, we were not suspected to be other than what we seemed. In this manner the fortnight passed away. During that time I had the pleasing conviction that Agnes was once more at liberty. She passed through the village with Dame Cunegonda. She seemed in health and spirits, and talked to her companion without any appearance of constraint. "Who are those ladies?" said I to my host, as the carriage passed. "Baron Lindenberg's niece with her governess," he replied. "She goes regularly every Friday to the convent of St. Catherine, in which she was brought up, and which is situated about a mile from hence." You may be certain that I waited with impatience for the ensuing Friday. I again beheld my lovely mistress. She cast her eyes upon me as she passed the inn door. A blush which overspread her cheek told me that in spite of my disguise I had been recognized. I bowed profoundly. She returned the compliment by a slight inclination of the head as if made to one inferior, and looked another way till the carriage was out of sight. The long-expected, long-wished-for night arrived. It was calm, and the moon was at the full. As soon as the clock struck 11, I hastened to my appointment, determined not to be too late. Theodore had provided a ladder. I ascended the garden wall without difficulty. The page followed me and drew the ladder after us. I posted myself in the west pavilion and waited impatiently for the approach of Agnes. Every breeze that whispered, every leaf that fell, I believed to be her footstep, and hastened to meet her. Thus was I obliged to pass a full hour, every minute of which appeared to me an age. The castle bell at length tolled 12, and scarcely could I believe the night to be no further advanced. Another quarter of an hour elapsed, and I heard the light foot of my mistress approaching the pavilion with precaution. I flew to receive her and conducted her to a seat. I threw myself at her feet, and was expressing my joy at seeing her when she thus interrupted me. "We have no time to lose, Alfonso. The moments are precious, for though no more a prisoner, Cunegonda watches my every step. An express is arrived from my father. I must depart immediately for Madrid, and 'tis with difficulty that I have obtained a week's delay. The superstition of my parents, supported by the representations of my cruel aunt, leaves me no hope of softening them to compassion. In this dilemma, I have resolved to commit myself to your honour. God grant that you may never give me cause to repent my resolution. Flight is my only resource from the horrors of a convent, and my imprudence must be excused by the urgency of the danger. Now listen to the plan by which I hope to effect my escape. We are now at the 30th of April. On the 5th day from this, the visionary nun is expected to appear. In my last visit to the convent, I provided myself with a dress proper for the character. A friend, whom I have left there, and to whom I made no scruple to confide my secret, readily consented to supply me with a religious habit. Provide a carriage, and be with it at a little distance from the great gate of the castle. As soon as the clock strikes 1, I shall quit my chamber, dressed in the same apparel as the ghost is supposed to wear. Whoever meets me will be too much terrified to oppose my escape. I shall easily reach the door, and throw myself under your protection. Thus far success is certain. But oh, Alfonso, should you deceive me, should you despise my imprudence and reward it with ingratitude, the world will not hold a being more wretched than myself. I feel all the dangers to which I shall be exposed. I feel that I am giving you a right to treat me with levity, but I rely upon your love, upon your honour. The step which I am on the point of taking will incense my relations against me. Should you desert me, should you betray the trust reposed in you, I shall have no friend to punish your insult or support my cause. On yourself alone rests all my hope, and if your own heart does not plead in my behalf, I am undone for ever." The tone in which she pronounced these words was so touching that in spite of my joy at receiving her promise to follow me, I could not help being affected. I also repined in secret at not having taken the precaution to provide a carriage at the village, in which case I might have carried off Agnes that very night. Such an attempt was now impracticable. Neither carriage or horses were to be procured nearer than Munich, which was distant from Lindenberg 2 good days' journey. I was therefore obliged to chime in with her plan, which in truth seemed well arranged. Her disguise would secure her from being stopped in quitting the castle, and would enable her to step into the carriage at the very gate without difficulty or losing time. Agnes reclined her head mournfully upon my shoulder, and by the light of the moon I saw tears flowing down her cheek. I strove to dissipate her melancholy, and encouraged her to look forward to the prospect of happiness. I protested in the most solemn terms that her virtue and innocence would be safe in my keeping, and that till the Church had made her my lawful wife, her honour should be held by me as sacred as a sister's. I told her that my first care should be to find you out, Lorenzo, and reconcile you to our union, and I was continuing to speak in the same strain when a noise without alarmed me. Suddenly the door of the pavilion was thrown open, and Cunegonda stood before us. She had heard Agnes steal out of her chamber, followed her into the garden, and perceived her entering the pavilion. Favoured by the trees which shaded it, and unperceived by Theodore, who waited at a little distance, she had approached in silence, and overheard our whole conversation. "Admirable!" cried Cunegonda, in a voice shrill with passion, while Agnes uttered a loud shriek. "By Saint Barbara, young lady, you have an excellent invention. You must personate the bleeding nun, truly. What impiety! What incredulity! Marry, I have a good mind to let you pursue your plan. When the real ghost met you, I warrant you would be in a pretty condition. Don Alfonso, you ought to be ashamed of yourself for seducing a young ignorant creature to leave her family and friends, however. For this time at least I shall mar your wicked designs." the noble lady shall be informed of the whole affair, and Agnes must defer playing the spectre till a better opportunity. Farewell, Signor, Donna Agnes. Let me have the honour of conducting your ghost ship back to your apartment." She approached the sofa on which her trembling pupil was seated, took her by the hand, and prepared to lead her from the pavilion. I detained her, and strove by entreaties, soothing, promises, and flattery to win her to my party, but finding all that I could say of no avail, I abandoned the vain attempt. "Your obstinacy must be its own punishment," said I, "but one resource remains to save Agnes and myself, and I shall not hesitate to employ it." Terrified at this menace, she again endeavoured to quit the pavilion, but I seized her by the wrist and detained her forcibly. At the same moment Theodore, who had followed her into the room, closed the door and prevented her escape. I took the veil of Agnes, I threw it round the duenna's head, who uttered such piercing shrieks that in spite of our distance from the castle, I dreaded their being heard. At length I succeeded in gagging her so completely that she could not produce a single sound. Theodore and myself, with some difficulty next, contrived to bind her hands and feet with our handkerchiefs, and I advised Agnes to regain her chamber with all diligence. I promised that no harm should happen to Cunegonde, bade her remember that on the 5th of May I should be in waiting at the great gate of the castle, and took of her an affectionate farewell. Trembling and uneasy, she had scarce power enough to signify her consent to my plans, and fled back to her apartment in disorder and confusion. In the meanwhile, Theodore assisted me in carrying off my antiquated prize. She was hoisted over the wall, placed before me upon my horse like a portmanteau, and I galloped away with her from the castle of Lindenberg. The unlucky duenna never had made a more disagreeable journey in her life. She was jolted and shaken till she was become little more than an animated mummy, not to mention her fright when we waded through a small river through which it was necessary to pass in order to regain the village. Before we reached the inn, I had already determined how to dispose of the troublesome Cunegonde. We entered the street in which the inn stood, and while the page knocked, I waited at a little distance. The landlord opened the door with a lamp in his hand. "Give me the light," said Theodore. "My master is coming." He snatched the lamp hastily and purposely let it fall upon the ground. The landlord returned to the kitchen to relight the lamp, leaving the door open. I profited by the obscurity, sprang from my horse with Cunegonde in my arms, darted upstairs, reached my chamber unperceived, and unlocking the door of a spacious closet, stowed her within it, and then turned the key. The landlord and Theodore soon after appeared with lights. The former expressed himself a little surprised at my returning so late, but asked no impertinent questions. He soon quitted the room, and left me to exult in the success of my undertaking. I immediately paid a visit to my prisoner. I strove to persuade her submitting with patience to her temporary confinement. My attempt was unsuccessful. Unable to speak or move, she expressed her fury by her looks, and except at meals I never dared to unbind her or release her from the gag. At such times I stood over her with a drawn sword, and protested that if she uttered a single cry, I would plunge it in her bosom. As soon as she had done eating, the gag was replaced. I was conscious that this proceeding was cruel, and could only be justified by the urgency of circumstances. As to Theodore, he had no scruples upon the subject. Cunegonde's captivity entertained him beyond measure. During his abode in the castle, a continual warfare had been carried on between him and the duenna, and now that he found his enemy so absolutely in his power, he triumphed without mercy. He seemed to think of nothing but how to find out new means of plaguing her. Sometimes he affected to pity her misfortune, then laughed at, abused, and mimicked her. He played her 1,000 tricks, each more provoking than the other, and amused himself by telling her that her elopement must have occasioned much surprise at the barons. This was in fact the case. No one except Agnes could imagine what was become of Dame Cunegonde. Every hole and corner was searched for her, the ponds were dragged, and the woods underwent a thorough examination. Still no Dame Cunegonde made her appearance. Agnes kept the secret, and I kept the duenna. The Baroness, therefore, remained in total ignorance respecting the old woman's fate, but suspected her to have perished by suicide. Thus passed away 5 days, during which I had prepared everything necessary for my enterprise. On quitting Agnes, I had made it my first business to dispatch a peasant with a letter to Lucas at Munich, ordering him to take care that a coach and 4 should arrive about 10 o'clock on the 5th of May at the village of Rosenwald. He obeyed my instructions punctually. The equipage arrived at the time appointed. As the period of her lady's elopement drew nearer, Cunegonde's rage increased. I verily believe that spite and passion would have killed her, had I not luckily discovered her prepossession in favour of cherry brandy. With this favourite liquor she was plentifully supplied, and Theodore always remaining to guard her, the gag was occasionally removed. The liquor seemed to have a wonderful effect in softening the acrimony of her nature, and her confinement not admitting of any other amusement, she got drunk regularly once a day just by way of passing the time. The 5th of May arrived, a period by me never to be forgotten. Before the clock struck 12, I betook myself to the scene of action. Theodore followed me on horseback. I concealed the carriage in a spacious cavern of the hill on whose brow the castle was situated. This cavern was of considerable depth, and among the peasants was known by the name of Lindenberg Hole. The night was calm and beautiful. The moonbeams fell upon the antient towers of the castle, and shed upon their summits a silver light. All was still around me. Nothing was to be heard except the night breeze sighing among the leaves, the distant barking of village dogs, or the owl who had established herself in a nook of the deserted eastern turret. I heard her melancholy shriek, and looked upwards. She sat upon the ride of a window, which I recognized to be that of the haunted room. This brought to my remembrance the story of the bleeding nun, and I sighed while I reflected on the influence of superstition and weakness of human reason. Suddenly I heard a faint chorus steal upon the silence of the night. "What can occasion that noise, Theodore?" "A stranger of distinction," replied he, "passed through the village today in his way to the castle. He is reported to be the father of Donna Agnes. Doubtless, the Baron has given an entertainment to celebrate his arrival." The castle bell announced the hour of midnight. This was the usual signal for the family to retire to bed. Soon after I perceived lights in the castle moving backwards and forwards in different directions. I conjectured the company to be separating. I could hear the heavy doors grate as they opened with difficulty, and as they closed again the rotten casements rattled in their frames. The chamber of Agnes was on the other side of the castle. I trembled lest she should have failed in obtaining the key of the haunted room. Through this it was necessary for her to pass in order to reach the narrow staircase by which the ghost was supposed to descend into the great hall. Agitated by this apprehension, I kept my eyes constantly fixed upon the window, where I hoped to perceive the friendly glare of a lamp borne by Agnes. I now heard the massy gates unbarred. By the candle in his hand I distinguished old Conrad, the porter. He set the portal doors wide open and retired. The lights in the castle gradually disappeared, and at length the whole building was wrapped in darkness. While I sat upon a broken ridge of the hill, the stillness of the scene inspired me with melancholy ideas not altogether unpleasing. The castle, which stood full in my sight, formed an object equally awful and picturesque. Its ponderous walls tinged by the moon with solemn brightness, its old and partly ruined towers lifting themselves into the clouds and seeming to frown on the plains around them, its lofty battlements overgrown with ivy, and folding gates expanding in honour of the visionary inhabitant, made me sensible of a sad and reverential horror. Yet did not these sensations occupy me so fully as to prevent me from witnessing with impatience the slow progress of time. I approached the castle and ventured to walk round it. A few rays of light still glimmered in the chamber of Agnes. I observed them with joy. I was still gazing upon them when I perceived a figure drawn near the window, and the curtain was carefully closed to conceal the lamp which burned there. Convinced by this observation that Agnes had not abandoned our plan, I returned with a light heart to my former station. The half-hour struck, the 3/4 struck. My bosom beat high with hope and expectation. At length the wished-for sound was heard. The bell tolled 1, and the mansion echoed with the noise loud and solemn. I looked up to the casement of the haunted chamber. Scarcely had 5 minutes elapsed when the expected light appeared. I was now close to the tower. The window was not so far from the ground, but that I fancied I perceived a female figure with a lamp in her hand, moving slowly along the apartment. The light soon faded away, and all was again dark and gloomy. Occasional gleams of brightness darted from the staircase windows as the lovely ghost passed by them. I traced the light through the hall, it reached the portal, and at length I beheld Agnes pass through the folding gates. She was habited exactly as she had described the spectre. A chaplet of beads hung upon her arm. Her head was enveloped in a long white veil. Her nun's dress was stained with blood, and she had taken care to provide herself with a lamp and dagger. She advanced towards the spot where I stood. I flew to meet her and clasped her in my arms. "Agnes," said I, while I pressed her to my bosom, "Agnes, Agnes, thou art mine! Agnes, I am thine! In my veins while blood shall roll, thou art mine! I am thine, thine my body, thine my soul." Terrified and breathless, she was unable to speak. She dropped her lamp and dagger and sank upon my bosom in silence. I raised her in my arms and conveyed her to the carriage. Theodore remained behind in order to release Dame Cunegonda. I also charged him with a letter to the Baroness explaining the whole affair and entreating her good offices in reconciling Don Gaston to my union with his daughter. I discovered to her my real name. I proved to her that my birth and expectations justified my pretending to her niece, and assured her, though it was out of my power to return her love, that I would strive unceasingly to obtain her esteem and friendship. I stepped into the carriage, where Agnes was already seated. Theodore closed the door, and the postilions drove away. At first I was delighted with the rapidity of our progress, but as soon as we were in no danger of pursuit, I called to the drivers and bade them moderate their pace. They strove in vain to obey me. The horses refused to answer the rein, and continued to rush on with astonishing swiftness. The postilions redoubled their efforts to stop them, but by kicking and plunging the beasts soon released themselves from this restraint. Uttering a loud shriek, the drivers were hurled upon the ground. Immediately thick clouds obscured the sky, the winds howled around us, the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared tremendously. Never did I behold so frightful a tempest. Terrified by the jar of contending elements, the horses seemed every moment to increase their speed. Nothing could interrupt their career. They dragged the carriage through hedges and ditches, dashed down the most dangerous precipices, and seemed to vie in swiftness with the rapidity of the winds. All this while my companion lay motionless in my arms. Truly alarmed by the magnitude of the danger, I was in vain attempting to recall her to her senses when a loud crash announced that a stop was put to our progress in the most disagreeable manner. The carriage was shattered to pieces. In falling, I struck my temple against a flint. The pain of the wound, the violence of the shock, and apprehension for the safety of Agnes combined to overpower me so completely that my senses forsook me, and I lay without animation on the ground. I probably remained for some time in this situation, since when I opened my eyes it was broad daylight. Several peasants were standing round me, and seemed disputing whether my recovery was possible. I spoke German tolerably well. As soon as I could utter an articulate sound, I inquired after Agnes. What was my surprise and distress when assured by the peasants that nobody had been seen answering the description which I gave of her. They told me that in going to their daily labour, they had been alarmed by observing the fragments of my carriage, and by hearing the groans of an horse, the only one of the 4 which remained alive. The other 3 lay dead by my side. Nobody was near me when they came up, and much time had been lost before they succeeded in recovering me. Uneasy beyond expression respecting the fate of my companion, I besought the peasants to disperse themselves in search of her. I described her dress, and promised immense rewards to whoever brought me any intelligence. As for myself, it was impossible for me to join in the pursuit. I had broken 2 of my ribs in the fall. My arm, being dislocated, hung useless by my side, and my left leg was shattered so terribly that I never expected to recover its use. The peasants complied with my request. All left me except 4, who made a litter of boughs and prepared to convey me to the neighbouring town. I inquired its name. It proved to be Ratisbon, and I could scarcely persuade myself that I had travelled to such a distance in a single night. I told the countrymen that at 1 o'clock that morning I had passed through the village of Rosenwald. They shook their heads wistfully, and made signs to each other that I must certainly be delirious. I was conveyed to a decent inn, and immediately put to bed. A physician was sent for, who set my arm with success. He then examined my other hurts, and told me that I need be under no apprehension of the consequences of any of them, but ordered me to keep myself quiet, and be prepared for a tedious and painful cure. I answered him that if he hoped to keep me quiet, he must first endeavour to procure me some news of a lady who had quitted Rosenwald in my company the night before, and had been with me at the moment when the coach broke down. He smiled, and only replied by advising me to make myself easy, for that all proper care should be taken of me. As he quitted me, the hostess met him at the door of the room. "The gentleman is not quite in his right senses," I heard him say to her in a low voice. "'Tis the natural consequence of his fall, but that will soon be over." One after another the peasants returned to the inn, and informed me that no traces had been discovered of my unfortunate mistress. Uneasiness now became despair. I entreated them to renew their search in the most urgent terms, doubling the promises which I had already made them. My wild and frantic manner confirmed the bystanders in the idea of my being delirious. No signs of the lady having appeared, They believed her to be a creature fabricated by my overheated brain and paid no attention to my entreaties. However, the hostess assured me that a fresh enquiry should be made, but I found afterwards that her promise was only given to quiet me. No further steps were taken in the business. Though my baggage was left at Munich under the care of my French servant, having prepared myself for a long journey, my purse was amply furnished. Besides, my equipage proved me to be of distinction, and in consequence all possible attention was paid me at the inn. The day passed away, still no news arrived of Agnes. The anxiety of fear now gave place to despondency. I ceased to rave about her, and was plunged in the depth of melancholy reflections. Perceiving me to be silent and tranquil, my attendants believed my delirium to have abated, and that my malady had taken a favourable turn. According to the physician's order, I swallowed a composing medicine, and as soon as the night shut in, my attendants withdrew and left me to repose. That repose I wooed in vain. The agitation of my bosom chased away sleep. Restless in my mind, in spite of the fatigue of my body, I continued to toss about from side to side till the clock in a neighbouring steeple struck 1. As I listened to the mournful hollow sound and heard it die away in the wind, I felt a sudden chillness spread itself over my body. I shuddered without knowing wherefore. Cold dews poured down my forehead, and my hair stood bristling with alarm. Suddenly I heard slow and heavy steps ascending the staircase. By an involuntary movement I started up in my bed and drew back the curtain. A single rush, light which glimmered upon the hearth, shed a faint gleam through the apartment, which was hung with tapestry. A door was thrown open with violence. A figure entered and drew near my bed with solemn measured steps. With trembling apprehension I examined this midnight visitor. God Almighty, it was the bleeding nun, it was my lost companion. Her face was still veiled, but she no longer held her lamp and dagger. She lifted up her veil slowly. What a sight presented itself to my startled eyes! I beheld before me an animated corpse. Her countenance was long and haggard, her cheeks and lips were bloodless, the paleness of death was spread over her features, and her eyeballs, fixed steadfastly upon me, were lustreless and hollow. I gazed upon the spectre with horror too great to be described. My blood was frozen in my veins. I would have called for aid, but the sound expired ere it could pass my lips. My nerves were bound up in impotence, and I remained in the same attitude, inanimate as a statue. The visionary nun looked upon me for some minutes in silence. There was something petrifying in her regard. At length, in a low, sepulchral voice, she pronounced the following words: "Raymond, Raymond, thou art mine! Raymond, Raymond, Raymond! I am thine. In thy veins, while blood shall roll, I am thine. Thou art mine, mine thy body, mine thy soul." Breathless with fear, I listened while she repeated my own expressions. The apparition seated herself opposite to me at the foot of the bed, and was silent. Her eyes were fixed earnestly upon mine. They seemed endowed with the property of the rattlesnakes, for I strove in vain to look off her. My eyes were fascinated, and I had not the power of withdrawing them from the spectres. In this attitude she remained for a whole long hour without speaking or moving, nor was I able to do either. At length the clock struck 2. The apparition rose from her seat and approached the side of the bed. She grasped with her icy fingers my hand, which hung lifeless upon the coverture, and pressing her cold lips to mine, again repeated, "Raymond, Raymond, thou art mine! Raymond, 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 I am thine." And see, she then dropped my hand, quitted the chamber with slow steps, and the door closed after her. Till that moment the faculties of my body had been all suspended, those of my mind had alone been waking. The charm now ceased to operate. The blood which had been frozen in my veins rushed back to my heart with violence. I uttered a deep groan, and sank lifeless upon my pillow. The adjoining room was only separated from mine by a thin partition. It was occupied by the host and his wife. The former was roused by my groan, and immediately hastened to my chamber. The hostess soon followed him. With some difficulty they succeeded in restoring me to my senses, and immediately sent for the physician, who arrived in all diligence. He declared my fever to be very much increased, and that if I continued to suffer such violent agitation, he would not take upon him to ensure my life. Some medicines which he gave me in some degree tranquilized my spirits. I fell into a sort of slumber towards daybreak, but fearful dreams prevented me from deriving any benefit from my repose. Agnes and the bleeding nun presented themselves by turns to my fancy, and combined to harass and torment me. I awoke fatigued and unrefreshed. My fever seemed rather augmented than diminished. The agitation of my mind impeded my fractured bones from knitting. I had frequent fainting fits, and during the whole day the physician judged it expedient not to quit me for 2 hours together. The singularity of my adventure made me determined to conceal it from everyone, since I could not expect that a circumstance so strange should gain credit. I was very uneasy about Agnes. I knew not what she would think at not finding me at the rendezvous, and dreaded her entertaining suspicions of my fidelity. However, I depended upon Theodore's discretion, and trusted that my letter to the Baroness would convince her of the rectitude of my intentions. These considerations somewhat lightened my inquietude upon her account, but the impression left upon my mind by my nocturnal visitor grew stronger with every succeeding moment. The night drew near, I dreaded its arrival. Yet I strove to persuade myself that the ghost would appear no more, and at all events I desired that a servant might sit up in my chamber. The fatigue of my body from not having slept on the former night, cooperating with the strong opiates administered to me in profusion, at length procured me that repose of which I was so much in need. I sank into a profound and tranquil slumber, and had already slept for some hours when the neighbouring clock roused me by striking 1. Its sound brought with it to my memory all the horrors of the night before. The same cold shivering seized me. I started up in my bed and perceived the servant fast asleep in an armed-chair near me. I called him by his name. He made no answer. I shook him forcibly by the arm and strove in vain to wake him. He was perfectly insensible to my efforts. I now heard the heavy steps ascending the staircase, the door was thrown open, and again the bleeding nun stood before me. Once more my limbs were chained in second infancy. Once more I heard those fatal words repeated, "Raymond, Raymond, thou art mine! Raymond, Raymond, I am thine!" See, the scene which had shocked me so sensibly on the former night was again presented. The spectre again pressed her lips to mine, again touched me with her rotting fingers, and as on her first appearance, quitted the chamber as soon as the clock tolled 2. Even night was this repeated. Far from growing accustomed to the ghost, every succeeding visit inspired me with greater horror. Her idea pursued me continually, and I became the prey of habitual melancholy. The constant agitation of my mind naturally retarded the re-establishment of my health. Several months elapsed before I was able to quit my bed, and when at length I was moved to a sofa, I was so faint, spiritless, and emaciated that I could not cross the room without assistance. The looks of my attendants sufficiently denoted the little hope which they entertained of my recovery. The profound sadness which oppressed me without remission made the physician consider me to be an hypochondriac. The cause of my distress I carefully concealed in my own bosom, for I knew that no one could give me relief. The ghost was not even visible to any eye but mine. I had frequently caused attendants to sit up in my room, but the moment that the clock struck 1, irresistible slumber seized them, nor left them till the departure of the ghost. You may be surprised that during this time I made no inquiries after your sister. Theodore, who with difficulty had discovered my abode, had quieted my apprehensions for her safety. At the same time he convinced me that all attempts to release her from captivity must be fruitless till I should be in a condition to return to Spain. The particulars of her adventure, which I shall now relate to you, were partly communicated to me by Theodore, and partly by Agnes herself. On the fatal night when her elopement was to have taken place, accident had not permitted her to quit her chamber at the appointed time. At length she ventured into the haunted room, descended the staircase leading into the hall, found the gates open as she expected, and left the castle unobserved. What was her surprise at not finding me ready to receive her? She examined the cavern, ranged through every alley of the neighbouring wood, and passed 2 full hours in this fruitless inquiry. She could discover no traces either of me or of the carriage. Alarmed and disappointed, her only resource was to return to the castle before the Baroness missed her. But here she found herself in a fresh embarrassment. The bell had already tolled 2. The ghostly hour was past, and the careful porter had locked the folding gates. After much irresolution, she ventured to knock softly. Luckily for her, Conrad was still awake. He heard the noise and rose, murmuring at being called up a second time. No sooner had he opened one of the doors and beheld the supposed apparition waiting there for admittance, than he uttered a loud cry and sank upon his knees. Agnes profited by his terror. She glided by him, flew to her own apartment, and having thrown off her spectre's trappings, retired to bed, endeavouring in vain to account for my disappearing. In the meanwhile, Theodore, having seen my carriage drive off with the false Agnes, returned joyfully to the village. The next morning he released Cunegonde from her confinement, and accompanied her to the castle. There he found the Baron, his lady, and Don Gaston, disputing together upon the porter's relation. All of them agreed in believing the existence of spectres, but the latter contended that for a ghost to knock for admittance was a proceeding till then unwitnessed, and totally incompatible with the immaterial nature of a spirit. They were still discussing this subject when the page appeared with Cunegonde and cleared up the mystery. On hearing his deposition, it was agreed unanimously that the Agnes whom Theodore had seen step into my carriage must have been the bleeding nun, and that the ghost who had terrified Conrad was no other than Don Gaston's daughter. The first surprise which this discovery occasioned being over, the Baroness resolved to make it of use in persuading her niece to take the veil. Fearing lest so advantageous an establishment for his daughter should induce Don Gaston to renounce his resolution, she suppressed my letter and continued to represent me as a needy, unknown adventurer. A childish vanity had led me to conceal my real name even from my mistress. I wished to be loved for myself, not for being the son and heir of the Marquis de la Cisternas. The consequence was that my rank was known to no one in the castle except the Baroness, and she took good care to confine the knowledge to her own breast. Don Gaston having approved his sister's design, Agnes was summoned to appear before them. She was taxed with having meditated an elopement, obliged to make a full confession, and was amazed at the gentleness with which it was received. But what was her affliction when informed that the failure of her project must be attributed to me? Cunegonde, tutored by the Baroness, told her that when I released her, I had desired her to inform her lady that our connection was at an end, that the whole affair was occasioned by a false report, and that it by no means suited my circumstances to marry a woman without fortune or expectations. To this account, my sudden disappearing gave but too great an air of probability. Theodore, who could have contradicted the story, by Donna Rodolpha's order was kept out of her sight. What proved a still greater confirmation of my being an impostor was the arrival of a letter from yourself declaring that you had no sort of acquaintance with Alfonso d'Alvarado. These seeming proofs of my perfidy, aided by the artful insinuations of her aunt, by Cunegonde's flattery and her father's threats and anger, entirely conquered your sister's repugnance to a convent. Incensed at my behaviour and disgusted with the world in general, she consented to receive the veil. She passed another month at the castle of Lindenberg, during which my non-appearance confirmed her in her resolution, and then accompanied Don Gaston into Spain. Theodore was now set at liberty. He hastened to Munich, where I had promised to let him hear from me. But finding from Lucas that I had never arrived there, he pursued his search with indefatigable perseverance, and at length succeeded in rejoining me at Ratisbon. So much was I altered, that scarcely could he recollect my features. The distress visible upon his sufficiently testified how lively was the interest which he felt for me. The society of this amiable boy, whom I had always considered rather as a companion than a servant, was now my only comfort. His conversation was gay yet sensible, and his observations shrewd and entertaining. He had picked up much more knowledge than is usual at his age, but what rendered him most agreeable to me was his having a delightful voice and some skill in music. He had also acquired some taste in poetry, and even ventured sometimes to write verses himself. He occasionally composed little ballads in Spanish. His compositions were but indifferent, I must confess, yet they were pleasing to me from their novelty, and hearing him sing them to his guitar was the only amusement which I was capable of receiving. Theodore perceived well enough that something preyed upon my mind, but as I concealed the cause of my grief even from him, respect would not permit him to pry into my secrets. One evening, I was lying upon my sofa, plunged in reflections very far from agreeable. Theodore amused himself by observing from the window a battle between two postilions who were quarrelling in the inn-yard. "Ha, ha!" cried he suddenly, "yonder is the great Mogul." "Who?" said I. "Only a man who made me a strange speech at Munich." "And what was the purport of it?" "Now you put me in mind of it, Señor. It was a kind of message to you, but truly it was not worth delivering. I believe the fellow to be mad, for my part. When I came to Munich in search of you, I found him living at the King of the Romans, and the host gave me an odd account of him. By his accent he is supposed to be a foreigner, but of what country nobody can tell. He seemed to have no acquaintance in the town, spoke very seldom, and never was seen to smile. He had neither servants or baggage, but his purse seemed well furnished, and he did much good in the town. Some supposed him to be an Arabian astrologer, others to be a travelling mountebank, and many declared that he was Dr. Faustus, whom the devil had sent back to Germany. The landlord, however, told me that he had the best reasons to believe him to be the great Mogul incognito. But the strange speech, Theodore. "True, I had almost forgotten the speech. Indeed, for that matter, it would not have been a great loss if I had forgotten it altogether. You are to know, Senor, that while I was inquiring about you of the landlord, this stranger passed by. He stopped and looked at me earnestly. Youth, said he in a solemn voice, he whom you seek has found that which he would fain lose. My hand alone can dry up the blood. Bid your master wish for me when the clock strikes 1. How? Cried I, starting from my sofa. The words which Theodore had repeated seemed to imply the stranger's knowledge of my secret. Fly to him, my boy. Entreat him to grant me 1 moment's conversation. Theodore was surprised at the vivacity of my manner. However, he asked no questions, but hastened to obey me. I waited his return impatiently. But a short space of time had elapsed when he again appeared and ushered the expected guest into my chamber. He was a man of majestic presence. His countenance was strongly marked, and his eyes were large, black and sparkling. Yet there was a something in his look which, the moment that I saw him, inspired me with a secret awe, not to say horror. He was dressed plainly. His hair was unpowdered, and a band of black velvet which encircled his forehead spread over his features an additional gloom. His countenance wore the marks of profound melancholy. His step was slow, and his manner grave, stately, and solemn. He saluted me with politeness, and having replied to the usual compliments of introduction, he motioned to Theodore to quit the chamber. The page instantly withdrew. I know your business, said he, without giving me time to speak. I have the power of releasing you from your nightly visitor, but this cannot be done before Sunday. On the hour when the Sabbath morning breaks, spirits of darkness have least influence over mortals. After Saturday the nun shall visit you no more. May I not inquire, said I, by what means you are in possession of a secret which I have carefully concealed from the knowledge of everyone? How can I be ignorant of your distress when their cause at this moment stands beside you? I started. The stranger continued. Though to you only visible for 1 hour in the 24, neither day or night does she ever quit you, nor will she ever quit you till you have granted her request. And what is that request? That she must herself explain, it lies not in my knowledge. Wait with patience for the night of Saturday. All shall be then cleared up. I dared not press him further. He soon after changed the conversation and talked of various matters. He named people who had ceased to exist for many centuries, and yet with whom he appeared to have been personally acquainted. I could not mention a country however distant which he had not visited, nor could I sufficiently admire the extent and variety of his information. I remarked to him that having travelled, seen, and known so much, must have given him infinite pleasure. He shook his head mournfully. No one, he replied, is adequate to comprehending the misery of my lot. Fate obliges me to be constantly in movement. I am not permitted to pass more than a fortnight in the same place. I have no friend in the world, and from the restlessness of my destiny I never can acquire one. Fain would I lay down my miserable life, for I envy those who enjoy the quiet of the grave, but death eludes me and flies from my embrace. In vain do I throw myself in the way of danger. I plunge into the ocean. The waves throw me back with abhorrence upon the shore. I rush into fire. The flames recoil at my approach. I oppose myself to the fury of banditti. Their swords become blunted and break against my breast. The hungry tiger shudders at my approach, and the alligator flies from a monster more horrible than itself. God has set his seal upon me, and all his creatures respect this fatal mark. He put his hand to the velvet, which was bound round his forehead. There was in his eyes an expression of fury, despair, and malevolence that struck horror to my very soul. An involuntary convulsion made me shudder. The stranger perceived it. Such is the curse imposed on me, he continued. I am doomed to inspire all who look on me with terror and detestation. You already feel the influence of the charm, and with every succeeding moment will feel it more. I will not add to your sufferings by my presence. Farewell till Saturday. As soon as the clock strikes 12, expect me at your chamber door. Having said this, he departed, leaving me in astonishment at the mysterious turn of his manner and conversation. His assurances that I should soon be relieved from the apparition's visits produced a good effect upon my constitution. Theodore, whom I rather treated as an adopted child than a domestic, was surprised at his return to observe the amendment in my looks. He congratulated me on this symptom of returning health, and declared himself delighted at my having received so much benefit from my conference with the Great Mogul. Upon inquiry I found that the stranger had already passed 8 days in Ratisbon, according to his own account. Therefore, he was only to remain there 6 days longer. Saturday was still at the distance of 3. Oh, with what impatience did I expect its arrival! In the interim, the bleeding nun continued her nocturnal visits, but hoping soon to be released from them altogether, the effects which they produced on me became less violent than before. The wished-for night arrived. To avoid creating suspicion, I retired to bed at my usual hour. But as soon as my attendants had left me, I dressed myself again and prepared for the stranger's reception. He entered my room upon the turn of midnight. A small chest was in his hand, which he placed near the stove. He saluted me without speaking. I returned the compliment, observing an equal silence. He then opened his chest. The first thing which he produced was a small wooden crucifix. He sank upon his knees, gazed upon it mournfully, and cast his eyes towards heaven. He seemed to be praying devoutly. At length he bowed his head respectfully, kissed the crucifix thrice, and quitted his kneeling posture. He next drew from the chest a covered goblet, with the liquor which it contained, and which appeared to be blood. He sprinkled the floor, and then dipping in it one end of the crucifix, he described a circle in the middle of the room. Round about this he placed various relics, skulls, thigh bones, and I observed that he disposed them all in the forms of crosses. Lastly he took out a large Bible, and beckoned me to follow him into the circle. I obeyed. "Be cautious not to utter a syllable," whispered the stranger. "Step not out of the circle, and as you love yourself, dare not to look upon my face." Holding the crucifix in one hand, the Bible in the other, he seemed to read with profound attention. The clock struck 1. As usual, I heard the spectre's steps upon the staircase, but I was not seized with the accustomed shivering. I waited her approach with confidence. She entered the room, drew near the circle, and stopped. The stranger muttered some words, to me unintelligible. Then raising his head from the book, and extending the crucifix towards the ghost, he pronounced in a voice distinct and solemn, "Beatrice! Beatrice! Beatrice!" "What wouldst thou?" replied the apparition in a hollow, faltering tone. "What disturbs thy sleep? Why dost thou afflict and torture this youth? How can rest be restored to thy unquiet spirit? I dare not tell. I must not tell. Fain would I repose in my grave, but stern commands force me to prolong my punishment. Knowest thou this blood? Knowest thou in whose veins it flowed? Beatrice, Beatrice, in his name I charge thee to answer me. I dare not disobey my taskers. Darest thou disobey me?" He spoke in a commanding tone, and drew the sable band from his forehead. In spite of his injunctions to the contrary, curiosity would not suffer me to keep my eyes off his face. I raised them, and beheld a burning cross impressed upon his brow. For the horror with which this object inspired me I cannot account, but I never felt its equal. My senses left me for some moments. A mysterious dread overcame my courage, and had not the exorciser caught my hand, I should have fallen out of the circle. When I recovered myself, I perceived that the burning cross had produced an effect no less violent upon the spectre. Her countenance expressed reverence and horror, and her visionary limbs were shaken by fear. "Yes," she said at length, "I tremble at that mark, respect it, I obey you. Know then that my bones lie still unburied, they rot in the obscurity of Lindenberg Hole. None but this youth has the right of consigning them to the grave. His own lips have made over to me his body and his soul. Never will I give back his promise. Never shall he know a night devoid of terror, unless he engages to collect my mouldering bones and deposit them in the family vault of his Andalusian castle. Then let 30 masses be said for the repose of my spirit, and I trouble this world no more. Now let me depart, those flames are scorching." He let the hand drop slowly which held the crucifix, and which till then he had pointed towards her. The apparition bowed her head, and her form melted into air. The exorciser led me out of the circle. He replaced the Bible and in the chest, and then addressed himself to me, who stood near him speechless from astonishment. "Don Raymond, you have heard the conditions on which repose is promised you. Be it your business to fulfill them to the letter. For me nothing more remains than to clear up the darkness still spread over the spectre's history, and inform you that when living, Beatrice bore the name of Las Cisternas. She was the great-aunt of your grandfather, in quality of your relation. Her ashes demand respect from you, though the enormity of her crimes must excite your abhorrence. The nature of those crimes no one is more capable of explaining to you than myself. I was personally acquainted with the holy man who prescribed her nocturnal riots in the castle of Lindenberg, and I hold this narrative from his own lips. Beatrice de las Cisternas took the veil at an early age, not by her own choice, but at the express command of her parents. She was then too young to regret the pleasures of which her profession deprived her, but no sooner did her warm and voluptuous character begin to be developed than she abandoned herself freely to the impulse of her passions, and seized the first opportunity to procure their gratification. This opportunity was at length presented, after many obstacles which only added new force to her desires. She contrived to elope from the convent, and fled to Germany with the Baron Lindenberg. She lived at his castle several months as his avowed concubine. All Bavaria was scandalized by her impudent and abandoned conduct. Her feasts vied in luxury with Cleopatra's, and Lindenberg became the theatre of the most unbridled debauchery. Not satisfied with displaying the incontinence of a prostitute, she professed herself an atheist. She took every opportunity to scoff at her monastic vows, and loaded with ridicule the most sacred ceremonies of religion. Possessed of a character so depraved, she did not long confine her affections to one object. Soon after her arrival at the castle, the Baron's younger brother attracted her notice by his strong-marked features, gigantic stature, and Herculean limbs. She was not of an humour to keep her inclinations long unknown, but she found in Otto von Lindenberg her equal in depravity. He returned her passion just sufficiently to increase it, and when he had worked it up to the desired pitch, he fixed the price of his love at his brother's murder. The wretch consented to this horrible agreement. A knight was pitched upon for perpetrating the deed. Otto, who resided on a small estate a few miles distant from the castle, promised that at 1 in the morning he would be waiting for her at Lindenberg Hole. That he would bring with him a party of chosen friends, by whose aid he doubted not being able to make himself master of the castle, and that his next step should be the uniting her hand to his. It was this last promise which overruled every scruple of Beatrice, since in spite of his affection for her, the Baron had declared positively that he never would make her his wife. The fatal night arrived. The Baron slept in the arms of his perfidious mistress when the castle bell struck 1. Immediately Beatrice drew a dagger from underneath the pillow and plunged it in her paramour's heart. The Baron uttered a single dreadful groan and expired. The murderess quitted her bed hastily, took a lamp in one hand, in the other the bloody dagger, and bent her course towards the cavern. The porter dared not to refuse opening the gates to one more dreaded in the castle than its master. Beatrice reached Lindenberg Hole unopposed, where according to promise she found Otto waiting for her. He received and listened to her narrative with transport, but ere she had time to ask why he came unaccompanied, he convinced her that he wished for no witnesses to their interview. Anxious to conceal his share in the murder, and to free himself from a woman whose violent and atrocious character made him tremble with reason for his own safety, he had resolved on the destruction of his wretched agent. Rushing upon her suddenly, he wrested the dagger from her hand. He plunged it still reeking with his brother's blood in her bosom, and put an end to her existence by repeated blows. Otto now succeeded to the barony of Lindenberg. The murder was attributed solely to the fugitive nun, and no one suspected him to have persuaded her to the action. But though his crime was unpunished by man, God's justice permitted him not to enjoy in peace his blood-stained honours. Her bones lying still unburied in the cave, the restless soul of Beatrice continued to inhabit the castle. Dressed in her religious habit in memory of her vows broken to heaven, furnished with the dagger which had drank the blood of her paramour, and holding the lamp which had guided her flying steps, every night did she stand before the bed of Otto. The most dreadful confusion reigned through the castle. The vaulted chambers resounded with shrieks and groans, and the spectre, as she ranged along the antique galleries, uttered an incoherent mixture of prayers and blasphemies. Otto was unable to withstand the shock which he felt at this fearful vision. Its horror increased with every succeeding appearance. His alarm at length became so insupportable that his heart burst, and one morning he was found in his bed totally deprived of warmth and animation. His death did not put an end to the nocturnal riots. The bones of Beatrice continued to lie unburied, and her ghost continued to haunt the castle. The domains of Lindenberg now fell to a distant relation, but terrified by the accounts given him of the bleeding nun, so was the spectre called by the multitude, the new baron called to his assistance a celebrated exorciser. This holy man succeeded in obliging her to temporary repose, but though she discovered to him her history, he was not permitted to reveal it to others, or cause her skeleton to be removed to hallowed ground. That office was reserved for you. Until your coming, her ghost was doomed to wander about the castle and lament the crime which she had there committed. However, The exorciser obliged her to silence during his lifetime. So long as he existed, the haunted chamber was shut up and the spectre was invisible. At his death, which happened in 5 years after, she again appeared. But only once on every 5th year, on the same day and at the same hour when she plunged her knife in the heart of her sleeping lover. She then visited the cavern which held her mouldering skeleton, returned to the castle as soon as the clock struck 2, and was seen no more till the next 5 years had elapsed. She was doomed to suffer during the space of a century. That period is past. Nothing now remains but to consign to the grave the ashes of Beatrice. I have been the means of releasing you from your visionary tormentor, and amidst all the sorrows which oppress me, to think that I have been of use to you is some consolation. Youth, farewell. May the ghost of your relation enjoy that rest in the tomb which the Almighty's vengeance has denied to me forever. Here the stranger prepared to quit the apartment. Stay yet one moment, said I. You have satisfied my curiosity with regard to the spectre, but you leave me in prey to yet greater respecting yourself. Deign to inform me to whom I am under such real obligations. You mention circumstances long past, and persons long dead. You were personally acquainted with the exorciser, who by your own account has been deceased near a century. How am I to account for this? What means that burning cross upon your forehead, and why did the sight of it strike such horror to my soul? On these points he, for some time, refused to satisfy me. At length, overcome by my entreaties, he consented to clear up the whole, on condition that I would defer his explanation till the next day. With this request I was obliged to comply, and he left me. In the morning my first care was to inquire after the mysterious stranger. Conceive my disappointment when informed that he had already quitted Ratisbon. I dispatched messengers in pursuit of him, but in vain. No traces of the fugitive were discovered. Since that moment I never have heard any more of him, and 'tis most probable that I never shall. Lorenzo here interrupted his friend's narrative. How? Said he. You have never discovered who he was, or even formed a guess? Pardon me, replied the Marquis. When I related this adventure to my uncle, the Cardinal Duke, he told me that he had no doubt of this singular man's being the celebrated character known universally by the name of the Wandering Jew, his not being permitted to pass more than 14 days on the same spot, the burning cross impressed upon his forehead, the effect which it produced upon the beholders, and many other circumstances give this supposition the colour of truth. The Cardinal is fully persuaded of it, and for my own part, one am inclined to adopt the only solution which offers itself to this riddle. I return to the narrative from which I have digressed. From this period, I recovered my health so rapidly as to astonish my physicians. The bleeding nun appeared no more, and I was soon able to set out for Lindenberg. The Baron received me with open arms. I confided to him the sequel of my adventure, and he was not a little pleased to find that his mansion would be no longer troubled with the phantom's quinennial visits. I was sorry to perceive that absence had not weakened Donna Rodolpha's imprudent passion. In a private conversation which I had with her during my short stay at the castle, she renewed her attempts to persuade me to return her affection. Regarding her as the primary cause of all my sufferings, I entertained for her no other sentiment than disgust. The skeleton of Beatrice was found in the place which she had mentioned. This being all that I sought at Lindenberg, I hastened to quit the Baron's domains, equally anxious to perform the obsequies of the murdered nun, and escape the importunity of a woman whom I detested. I departed, followed by Donna Rodolpha's menaces that my contempt should not be long unpunished. I now bent my course towards Spain with all diligence. Lucas with my baggage had joined me during my abode at Lindenberg. I arrived in my native country without any accident, and immediately proceeded to my father's castle in Andalusia. The remains of Beatrice were deposited in the family vault, all due ceremonies performed, and the number of masses said which she had required. Nothing now hindered me from employing all my endeavours to discover the retreat of Agnes. The Baroness had assured me that her niece had already taken the veil. This intelligence I suspected to have been forged by jealousy, and hoped to find my mistress still at liberty to accept my hand. I inquired after her family. I found that before her daughter could reach Madrid, Donna Inesilla was no more. You, my dear Lorenzo, was said to be abroad. But where I could not discover, your father was in a distant province on a visit to the Duke de Medina, and as to Agnes, no one could or would inform me what was become of her. Theodore, according to promise, had returned to Strasbourg, where he found his grandfather dead, and Marguerite in possession of his fortune. All her persuasions to remain with her were fruitless. he quitted her a second time and followed me to Madrid. He exerted himself to the utmost in forwarding my search, but our united endeavours were unattended by success. The retreat which concealed Agnes remained an impenetrable mystery, and I began to abandon all hopes of recovering her. About 8 months ago I was returning to my hotel in a melancholy humour, having passed the evening at the playhouse. The night was dark, and I was unaccompanied. Plunged in reflections which were far from being agreeable, I perceived not that 3 men had followed me from the theatre, till, on turning into an unfrequented street, they all attacked me at the same time with the utmost fury. I sprang back a few paces, drew my sword, and threw my cloak over my left arm. The obscurity of the night was in my favour. For the most part, the blows of the assassins, being aimed at random, failed to touch me. I at length was fortunate enough to lay one of my adversaries at my feet, but before this I had already received so many wounds and was so warmly pressed that my destruction would have been inevitable, had not the clashing of swords called a cavalier to my assistance. He ran towards me with his sword drawn. Several domestics followed him with torches. His arrival made the combat equal, yet would not the bravos abandon their design till the servants were on the point of joining us. They then fled away, and we lost them in the obscurity. The stranger now addressed himself to me with politeness, and inquired whether I was wounded. Faint with the loss of blood, I could scarcely thank him for his seasonable aid, and entreat him to let some of his servants convey me to the Hotel de las Cisternas. I no sooner mentioned the name than he professed himself an acquaintance of my father's, and declared that he would not permit my being transported to such a distance before my wounds had been examined. He added that his house was hard by, and begged me to accompany him thither. His manner was so earnest that I could not reject his offer, and leaning upon his arm, a few minutes brought me to the porch of a magnificent hotel. On entering the house, an old grey-headed domestic came to welcome my conductor. He inquired when the Duke, his master, meant to quit the country, and was answered that he would remain there yet some months. My deliverer then desired the family surgeon to be summoned without delay. His orders were obeyed. I was seated upon a sofa in a noble apartment, and my wounds being examined, they were declared to be very slight. The surgeon, however, advised me not to expose myself to the night air, and the stranger pressed me so earnestly to take a bed in his house that I consented to remain where I was for the present. Being now left alone with my deliverer, I took the opportunity of thanking him in more express terms than I had done hitherto, but he begged me to be silent upon the subject. "I esteem myself happy," said he, "in having had it in my power to render you this little service, and I shall think myself eternally obliged to my daughter for detaining me so late at the convent of St. Clair. The high esteem in which I have ever held the Marquis de las Cisternas, though accident has not permitted our being so intimate as I could wish, makes me rejoice in the opportunity of making his son's acquaintance. I am certain that my brother, in whose house you now are, will lament his not being at Madrid to receive you himself, but in the Duke's absence I am master of the family, and may assure you in his name that everything in the Hotel de Medina is perfectly at your disposal. Conceive my surprise, Lorenzo, at discovering in the person of my preserver, Don Gaston de Medina. It was only to be equalled by my secret satisfaction at the assurance that Agnes inhabited the convent of St. Clair. This latter sensation was not a little weakened, when in answer to my seemingly indifferent questions, he told me that his daughter had really taken the veil. I suffered not my grief at this circumstance to take root in my mind. I flattered myself with the idea that my uncle's credit at the court of Rome would remove this obstacle, and that without difficulty I should obtain for my mistress a dispensation from her vows. Buoyed up with this hope, I calmed the uneasiness of my bosom, and I redoubled my endeavours to appear grateful for the attention and pleased with the society of Don Gaston. A domestic now entered the room and informed me that the bravo whom I had wounded discovered some signs of life. I desired that he might be carried to my father's hotel, and that as soon as he recovered his voice, I would examine him respecting his reasons for attempting my life. I was answered that he was already able to speak, though with difficulty. Don Gaston's curiosity made him press me to interrogate the assassin in his presence, but this curiosity I was by no means inclined to gratify. One reason was, that doubting from whence the blow came, I was unwilling to place before Don Gaston's eyes the guilt of a sister. Another was, that I feared to be recognized for Alfonso d'Alvarado, and precautions taken in consequence to keep me from the sight of Agnes. To avow my passion for his daughter, and endeavour to make him enter into my schemes, what I knew of Don Gaston's character convinced me would be an imprudent step, and considering it to be essential that he should know me for no other than the Conde de las Cisternas, I was determined not to let him hear the bravo's confession. I insinuated to him that as I suspected a lady to be concerned in the business, whose name might accidentally escape from the assassin, it was necessary for me to examine the man in private. Don Gaston's delicacy would not permit his urging the point any longer, and in consequence the bravo was conveyed to my hotel. The next morning I took leave of my host, who was to return to the Duke on the same day. My wounds had been so trifling that, except being obliged to wear my arm in a sling for a short time, I felt no inconvenience from the night's adventure. The surgeon who examined the bravo's wound declared it to be mortal. He had just time to confess that he had been instigated to murder me by the revengeful Donna Rodolpha, and expired in a few minutes after. All my thoughts were now bent upon getting to the speech of my lovely nun. Theodore set himself to work, and for this time with better success. He attacked the gardener of St. Clair so forcibly with bribes and promises that the old man was entirely gained over to my interests, and it was settled that I should be introduced into the convent in the character of his assistant. The plan was put into execution without delay. Disguised in a common habit, and a black patch covering one of my eyes, I was presented to the lady prioress, who condescended to approve of the gardener's choice. I immediately entered upon my employment. Botany having been a favourite study with me, I was by no means at a loss in my new station. For some days I continued to work in the convent garden without meeting the object of my disguise. On the fourth morning I was more successful. I heard the voice of Agnes, and was speeding towards the sound, when the sight of the domina stopped me. I drew back with caution, and concealed myself behind a thick clump of trees. The prioress advanced and seated herself with Agnes on a bench at no great distance. I heard her in an angry tone blame her companion's continual melancholy. She told her that to weep the loss of any lover in her situation was a crime, but that to weep the loss of a faithless one was folly and absurdity in the extreme. Agnes replied in so low a voice that I could not distinguish her words, but I perceived that she used terms of gentleness and submission. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young pensioner who informed the domina that she was waited for in the parlour. The old lady rose, kissed the cheek of Agnes, and retired. The newcomer remained. Agnes spoke much to her in praise of somebody whom I could not make out, but her auditor seemed highly delighted and interested by the conversation. The nun showed her several letters, the other perused them with evident pleasure, obtained permission to copy them, and withdrew for that purpose to my great satisfaction. No sooner was she out of sight than I quitted my concealment. Fearing to alarm my lovely mistress, I drew near her gently, intending to discover myself by degrees. But who for a moment can deceive the eyes of love? She raised her head at my approach, and recognized me in spite of my disguise at a single glance. She rose hastily from her seat with an exclamation of surprise, and attempted to retire, but I followed her, detained her, and entreated to be heard. Persuaded of my falsehood, she refused to listen to me, and ordered me positively to quit the garden. It was now my turn to refuse. I protested that however dangerous might be the consequences, I would not leave her till she had heard my justification. I assured her that she had been deceived by the artifices of her relations, that I could convince her beyond the power of doubt that my passion had been pure and disinterested, and I asked her what should induce me to seek her in the convent, were I influenced by the selfish motives which my enemies had ascribed to me. My prayers, my arguments, and vows not to quit her, till she had promised to listen to me, united to her fears lest the nuns should see me with her, to her natural curiosity, and to the affection which she still felt for me in spite of my supposed desertion, at length prevailed. She told me that to grant my request at that moment was impossible, but she engaged to be in the same spot at 11 that night, and to converse with me for the last time. Having obtained this promise, I released her hand, and she fled back with rapidity towards the convent. I communicated my success to my ally, the old gardener. He pointed out an hiding place where I might shelter myself till night without fear of a discovery. Thither I betook myself at the hour when I ought to have retired with my supposed master, and waited impatiently for the appointed time. The chillness of the night was in my favour, since it kept the other nuns confined to their cells. Agnes alone was insensible of the inclemency of the air, and before 11 joined me at the spot which had witnessed our former interview. Secure from interruption, I related to her the true cause of my disappearing on the fatal 5th of May. She was evidently much affected by my narrative. When it was concluded, she confessed the injustice of her suspicions, and blamed herself for having taken the veil through despair at my ingratitude. But now it is too late to repine," she added. "The die is thrown, I have pronounced my vows, and dedicated myself to the service of heaven. I am sensible how ill I am calculated for a convent. My disgust at a monastic life increases daily. Ennui and discontent are my constant companions, and I will not conceal from you that the passion which I formerly felt for one so near being my husband is not yet extinguished in my bosom. But we must part. Insuperable barriers divide us from each other, and on this side, the grave we must never meet again." I now exerted myself to prove that our union was not so impossible as she seemed to think it. I vaunted to her the Cardinal Duke of Lerma's influence at the court of Rome. I assured her that I should easily obtain a dispensation from her vows, and I doubted not but Don Gaston would coincide with my views when informed of my real name and long attachment. Agnes replied that since I encouraged such an hope, I could know but little of her father. Liberal and kind in every other respect, superstition formed the only stain upon his character. Upon this head he was inflexible. He sacrificed his dearest interests to his scruples, and would consider it an insult to suppose him capable of authorizing his daughter to break her vows to heaven. "But suppose," said I, interrupting her, "suppose that he should disapprove of our union, let him remain ignorant of my proceedings till I have rescued you from the prison in which you are now confined. Once my wife, you are free from his authority. I need from him no pecuniary assistance, and when he sees his resentment to be unavailing, he will doubtless restore you to his favour. But let the worst happen. Should Don Gaston be irreconcilable, my relations will vie with each other in making you forget his loss, and you will find in my father a substitute for the parent of whom I shall deprive you." "Don Raymond," replied Agnes in a firm and resolute voice, "I love my father. He has treated me harshly in this one instance, but I have received from him in every other so many proofs of love that his affection is become necessary to my existence. Were I to quit the convent, he never would forgive me, nor can I think that on his deathbed he would leave me his curse, without shuddering at the very idea. Besides, I am conscious myself that my vows are binding. Wilfully did I contract my engagement with heaven. I cannot break it without a crime. Then banish from your mind the idea of our being ever united. I am devoted to religion, and however I may grieve at our separation, I would oppose obstacles myself to what I feel would render me guilty." I strove to overrule these ill-grounded scruples. We were still disputing upon the subject, when the convent bell summoned the nuns to matins. Agnes was obliged to attend them, but she left me not till I had compelled her to promise that on the following night she would be at the same place at the same hour. These meetings continued for several weeks uninterrupted, and 'tis now, Lorenzo, that I must implore your indulgence. Reflect upon our situation, our youth, our long attachment, weigh all the circumstances which attended our assignations, and you will confess the temptation to have been irresistible. You will even pardon me when I acknowledge that in an unguarded moment the honour of Agnes was sacrificed to my passion." Lorenzo's eyes sparkled with fury. A deep crimson spread itself over his face. He started from his seat and attempted to draw his sword. The Marquis was aware of his movement and caught his hand. He pressed it affectionately. "My friend, my brother, hear me to the conclusion. Till then restrain your passion, and be at least convinced that if what I have related is criminal, the blame must fall upon me and not upon your sister." Lorenzo suffered himself to be prevailed upon by Don Raymond's entreaties. He resumed his place and listened to the rest of the narrative with a gloomy and impatient countenance. The Marquis thus continued. Scarcely was the first burst of passion past when Agnes, recovering herself, started from my arms with horror. She called me infamous seducer, loaded me with the bitterest reproaches, and beat her bosom in all the wildness of delirium. Ashamed of my imprudence, I with difficulty found words to excuse myself. I endeavoured to console her. I threw myself at her feet and entreated her forgiveness. She forced her hand from me, which I had taken, and would have pressed to my lips. "Touch me not," she cried with a violence which terrified me. "Monster of perfidy and ingratitude, how have I been deceived in you? I looked upon you as my friend, my protector. I trusted myself in your hands with confidence, and relying upon your honour, thought that mine ran no risk. And 'tis by you, whom I adored, that I am covered with infamy. 'Tis by you that I have been seduced into breaking my vows to God, that I am reduced to a level with the basest of my sex. Shame upon you, villain, you shall never see me more." She started from the bank on which she was seated. I endeavoured to detain her, but she disengaged herself from me with violence and took refuge in the convent. I retired, filled with confusion and inquietude. The next morning I failed not as usual to appear in the garden, but Agnes was nowhere to be seen. At night I waited for her at the place where we generally met. I found no better success. Several days and nights passed away in the same manner. At length I saw my offended mistress cross the walk on whose borders I was working. She was accompanied by the same young pensioner, on whose arm she seemed from weakness obliged to support herself. She looked upon me for a moment, but instantly turned her head away. I waited her return, but she passed on to the convent without paying any attention to me, or the penitent looks with which I implored her forgiveness. As soon as the nuns were retired, the old gardener joined me with a sorrowful air. "Signor," said he, "it grieves me to say that I can be no longer of use to you. The lady whom you used to meet has just assured me that if I admitted you again into the garden, she would discover the whole business to the lady prioress. She bade me tell you also that your presence was an insult, and that if you still possess the least respect for her, you will never attempt to see her more. Excuse me then for informing you that I can favour your disguise no longer. Should the prioress be acquainted with my conduct, she might not be contented with dismissing me her service. Out of revenge she might accuse me of having profaned the convent, and cause me to be thrown into the prisons of the Inquisition. Fruitless were my attempts to conquer his resolution. He denied me all future entrance into the garden, and Agnes persevered in neither letting me see or hear from her. In about a fortnight after, a violent illness which had seized my father obliged me to set out for Andalusia. I hastened thither, and as I imagined, found the Marquis at the point of death. Though on its first appearance his complaint was declared mortal, he lingered out several months, during which my attendance upon him during his malady, and the occupation of settling his affairs after his decease, permitted not my quitting Andalusia. Within these 4 days I returned to Madrid, and on arriving at my hotel, I there found this letter waiting for me. Here, the Marquis unlocked the drawer of a cabinet. He took out a folded paper, which he presented to his auditor. Lorenzo opened it and recognized his sister's hand. The contents were as follows. "Into what an abyss of misery have you plunged me, Raymond? You forced me to become as criminal as yourself. I had resolved never to see you more, if possible, to forget you, if not, only to remember you with hate. A being for whom I already feel a mother's tenderness solicits me to pardon my seducer and apply to his love for the means of preservation. Raymond, your child lives in my bosom. I tremble at the vengeance of the prioress. I tremble much for myself, yet more for the innocent creature whose existence depends upon mine. Both of us are lost, should my situation be discovered. Advise me then what steps to take, but seek not to see me. The gardener, who undertakes to deliver this, is dismissed, and we have nothing to hope from that quarter. The man engaged in his place is of incorruptible fidelity. The best means of conveying to me your answer is by concealing it under the great statue of St. Francis, which stands in the Capuchin Cathedral. Thither I go every Thursday to confession, and shall easily have an opportunity of securing your letter. I hear that you are now absent from Madrid. Need I entreat you to write the very moment of your return? I will not think it. Ah, Raymond, mine is a cruel situation. Deceived by my nearest relations, compelled to embrace a profession the duties of which I am ill calculated to perform, conscious of the sanctity of those duties, and seduced into violating them by one whom I least suspected of perfidy, I am now obliged by circumstances to choose between death and perjury. Woman's timidity and maternal affection permit me not to balance in the choice. I feel all the guilt into which I plunge myself, when I yield to the plan which you before proposed to me. My poor father's death, which has taken place since we met, has removed one obstacle. He sleeps in his grave, and I no longer dread his anger. But from the anger of God, oh, Raymond, who shall shield me? Who can protect me against my conscience, against myself? I dare not dwell upon these thoughts. They will drive me mad. I have taken my resolution. Procure a dispensation from my vows. I am ready to fly with you. Write to me, my husband. Tell me that absence has not abated your love. Tell me that you will rescue from death your unborn child and its unhappy mother. I live in all the agonies of terror. Every eye which is fixed upon me seems to read my secret and my shame. And you are the cause of those agonies. Oh, when my heart first loved you, how little did it suspect you of making it feel such pangs. Agnes. Having perused the letter, Lorenzo restored it in silence. The Marquis replaced it in the cabinet, and then proceeded. Excessive was my joy at reading this intelligence so earnestly desired, so little expected. My plan was soon arranged. When Don Gaston discovered to me his daughter's retreat, I entertained no doubt of her readiness to quit the convent. I had therefore entrusted the Cardinal Duke of Lerma with the whole affair, who immediately busied himself in obtaining the necessary bull. Fortunately, I had afterwards neglected to stop his proceedings. Not long since I received a letter from him, stating that he expected daily to receive the order from the court of Rome. Upon this I would willingly have relied, but the cardinal wrote me word that I must find some means of conveying Agnes out of the convent, unknown to the prioress. He doubted not, but this latter would be much incensed by losing a person of such high rank from her society, and consider the renunciation of Agnes as an insult to her house. He represented her as a woman of a violent and revengeful character, capable of proceeding to the greatest extremities. It was therefore to be feared, lest by confining Agnes in the convent she should frustrate my hopes and render the Pope's mandate unavailing. Influenced by this consideration, I resolved to carry off my mistress and conceal her till the arrival of the expected bull in the Cardinal Duke's estate. He approved of my design, and professed himself ready to give a shelter to the fugitive. I next caused the new gardener of Saint Clair to be seized privately and confined in my hotel. By this means I became master of the key to the garden door, and I had now nothing more to do than prepare Agnes for the elopement. This was done by the letter, which you saw me deliver this evening. I told her in it that I should be ready to receive her at 12 tomorrow night, that I had secured the key of the garden, and that she might depend upon a speedy release. You have now, Lorenzo, heard the whole of my long narrative. I have nothing to say in my excuse, save that my intentions towards your sister have been ever the most honourable, that it has always been, and still is, my design to make her my wife, and that I trust, when you consider these circumstances, our youth, and our attachment, you will not only forgive our momentary lapse from virtue, but will aid me in repairing my faults to Agnes, and securing a lawful title to her person and her heart.